Tonight, we're examining the dark and tragic history of Aemond Targaryen. There are some interesting details to follow, but I'll keep everything gentle enough for sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. Imagine, if you will, the flickering torchlight of the Red Keep in the year 110 after the conquest. A child is born into a house already divided by silent whispers and sharpening blades. This is Aemond, the second son of King Viserys I and Queen Alicent Hightower. From his first breath, he was a prince of the realm, yet he walked in the long, cold shadow of his older brother Aegon and the looming legacy of his half-sister Rhaenyra. To understand Aemond, you must understand the weight of that shadow. It was a weight that forged a boy into a weapon, a scholar into a dragon rider, and a prince into a kinslayer. Close your eyes and picture the hallways of the Red Keep. They are filled with the scent of old parchment, the metallic tang of polished armor, and the faint, ever-present smell of dragon fire from the pits below. Aemond grew up in a court where every smile was a mask, and every compliment was a calculated move in a game he did not yet fully comprehend. While his brother Aegon was indulged, and his sister Helaena drifted through the gardens chasing insects, Aemond was different. He was a boy of quiet intensity, a child who felt the sting of every perceived slight and the hollowness of every empty promise. He was the prince without a dragon, a source of mockery for his cousins, and a source of quiet disappointment for a father who was already fading into the twilight of his reign. The year 120, after the conquest, stands as a jagged line in the history of House Targaryen. It was the year that changed everything for Aemond. Imagine the salt-sprayed air of Driftmark, the sound of the waves crashing against the jagged rocks, and the mournful cries of a family gathered for a funeral. It was here, amidst the grief and the political maneuvering, that a 10-year-old boy decided he would no longer be the dragonless prince. He stepped out into the darkness of the night, guided only by the moon and a desperate, burning ambition. He sought out Vhagar, the oldest and largest dragon in the known world, a living relic of the conquest, who had once carried Queen Visenya herself. Think of the sheer scale of that moment. A small boy standing before a mountain of scales and ancient fire. Vhagar was a beast of legend, her wings wide enough to cover entire towns in shadow, her breath hot enough to melt stone. Aemond did not approach her with the practiced ease of a seasoned rider, but with the raw, terrifying courage of someone who had nothing left to lose. When he climbed onto her back and felt the massive beast rise into the sky, he wasn't just claiming a dragon, he was claiming his destiny. He was proving to his father, to his mother, and most importantly to his rivals, that he was a true son of old Valyria. But triumph is often followed by tragedy in the annals of the Dragon Kings. The flight of Vhagar did not go unnoticed. The confrontation that followed in the dim light of the stables is the stuff of nightmares. Imagine the shouting, the flash of steel, and the sudden, sickening spray of red. Lucerys Velaryon, a boy even younger than Aemond, swung a blade in fear and anger, and in one heartbeat, Aemond's world went dark on the right side. The loss of his eye was a physical wound that would never truly heal, but the psychological wound went much deeper. He did not cry out for mercy. Instead, he looked at his mother through his one remaining eye and told her that it was a fair trade. He had lost an eye, but he had gained a god. From that night forward, Aemond Targaryen was no longer just a prince. He was Aemond One Eye. He replaced his missing eye with a sapphire that glittered like ice, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for his power. He threw himself into his studies and his training with a ferocity that bordered on madness. He became a master of the blade, a student of history and philosophy, and a rider who moved in perfect, lethal sync with the ancient Vhagar. While others feasted and dallied, Aemond prepared. He knew that the peace of his father's reign was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of glass that would shatter the moment the old king drew his last breath. As we drift further into the history, consider the growing divide between the Greens and the Blacks. This wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a slow-motion collision of two worlds. Aemond was the iron heart of the Green faction. He saw Rhaenyra's sons, not as his nephews, but as bastards who stood between his family and their rightful place on the Iron Throne. The resentment that had started on the sands of Driftmark had curdled into a cold, calculating hatred. Every time he looked at Jacaerys or Lucerys, he saw the face of the boy who had blinded him. Every time he heard their names, he felt the phantom itch of a wound that would never close. The banquet in the year 127 is a perfect example of the tension that defined Aemond's life. Picture the long tables laden with food, the wine flowing freely, and the false laughter of a court trying to pretend that everything was fine. Aemond stood and raised his cup, his sapphire eye catching the light of 1,000 candles. He offered a toast to his strong nephews, a double-edged compliment that sliced through the room like a razor. It was a declaration of war, disguised as a gesture of peace. It showed that Aemond was not just a warrior, but a provocateur who knew exactly how to twist the knife. When King Viserys finally passed in the year 129, the world erupted in flames. The Dance of the Dragons was not a war of distant armies, but a family tearing itself apart in the sky. Aemond found himself at the center of the storm. He was the one who helped secure the coronation of his brother Aegon II. He was the one who rode Vhagar into the clouds to intercept the messengers of the Black Queen, and it was in the skies above Storm's End that Aemond truly earned the name that would haunt his legacy forever, Kinslayer. The encounter with Lucerys Velaryon at Storm's End was not supposed to be a massacre. It was supposed to be a diplomatic mission, but the storm that night was fierce, the rain lashing down like whips, and the thunder drowning out the screams of men. Aemond, riding the mountain that was Vhagar, hunted the smaller dragon Arrax through the clouds. It was a cat-and-mouse game played by giants. When the end came, it was swift and brutal. Vhagar, acting on the dark impulses of her rider, rose up and snapped the smaller dragon and its rider out of the sky. In that moment, the last chance for peace died. Aemond had his revenge, but he had also set the world on fire. The war that followed was a sequence of horrors. At the Battle of Rook's Rest, Aemond and Aegon ambushed the Princess Rhaenys and her dragon Meleys. It was a clash of titans that left the ground scorched and the sky filled with the scent of burning meat. Rhaenys died, and King Aegon was left broken and charred, a shell of the man he once was. In the vacuum of his brother's injury, Aemond stepped forward. He placed the iron and ruby crown of Aegon the Conqueror upon his own head and ruled as Prince Regent. He was the protector of the realm, a title he wore with a grim, relentless efficiency. He did not seek to be loved. He sought to be obeyed. His regency was marked by a series of brutal campaigns. He burned the Riverlands, turning fertile fields into ash and prosperous towns into graveyards. He was a shadow over the land, a vengeful god riding a beast of ancient myth. But even as he conquered, he was being hunted. His uncle, Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, was the only man who could match Aemond's skill and ferocity. Daemon was the dark mirror of Aemond, a man of blood and fire who lived by his own rules. The two were destined to meet, two dragons of the same blood, destined to consume one another. The climax of Aemond's life took place in the year 130, above the dark, still waters of the God's Eye. Harrenhal, the cursed fortress, stood as the silent witness to their final meeting. Daemon waited for 14 days, a lone figure on the battlements, until the shadow of Vhagar finally fell across the stones. The dialogue between the two men was brief, a final acknowledgement of their shared nature before the end. Aemond, with his sapphire eye and his ancient dragon, and Daemon, with his Valyrian steel blade Dark Sister and his lean red dragon Caraxes. The battle that followed was the greatest aerial duel in the history of Westeros. The two dragons tore at each other with teeth and claw, their fire lighting up the twilight like a second sun. They plummeted toward the lake, locked in a deadly embrace. In the final moments, Daemon Targaryen did the unthinkable. He unfastened his chains, leapt from his own dragon onto Vhagar, and drove Dark Sister through Aemond's sapphire eye, straight into his brain. They hit the water with the force of a falling star, and the lake swallowed them whole. Aemond Targaryen died as he lived, in a storm of violence, surrounded by fire, and defined by the dragon he had sacrificed everything to claim. His body remained at the bottom of the God's Eye for years, still strapped to the saddle of Vhagar, the sword of his uncle still buried in his skull. He was a man of immense talent and terrifying will, a prince who might have been a great king if he had not been consumed by the very flames he sought to master. As you drift off to sleep, think of the quiet after the splash, the way the waters of the God's Eye eventually stilled, and the way the legacy of the one-eyed prince became a cautionary tale whispered in the dark corners of history. Think of the Sapphire Eye, lost in the depths of the lake, a jewel that once saw the world not as it was, but as a place to be conquered. Think of Vhagar, the last of the great dragons of the conquest, finally finding rest in the cold mud of the Riverlands. The story of Aemond is a story of what happens when ambition is untempered by mercy, and when the wounds of the past are allowed to dictate the actions of the future. It is a story of fire and blood, of shadows and light, and of a prince who chose to burn bright and fast, rather than fade away in the long, grey twilight of a dying dynasty. The Red Keep still stands, its stones remembering the footsteps of the boy who wanted to be a god. The winds still howl over the God's Eye, carrying the echoes of a roar that once shook the world. But Aemond is gone, a ghost in the tapestry of House Targaryen, a name that brings a chill to the air, even centuries later. Let the weight of his history settle over you like a heavy blanket. Let the images of dragons and kings fade into the soft rhythm of your breathing. The war is over, the dragons are silent, and the prince is at rest. In the quiet of the night, we can see Aemond not just as a monster or a hero, but as a boy who was given a world on the brink of collapse and told to find his way through the dark. He found his way with fire, and he paid for it with his life. It is a tragedy that repeats itself through the ages, a cycle of vengeance and pride that only ends when there is nothing left to burn. But for now, the fires are out. The embers are glowing low. The sapphire is dark. Sleep now, and let the lore of the Dragon Kings carry you into a dreamless rest, far away from the heat of the battle and the cold of the lake. Consider the silence that followed the dance. A kingdom left scarred, a family reduced to a handful of survivors, and the dragons, those magnificent, terrible creatures, slowly fading from the world. Aemond was one of the last true dragon lords, a man who lived with the intensity of the fire he rode. His life was a testament to the power of the Targaryen bloodline, but also to its inherent danger. The same blood that allowed them to bond with dragons also carried the seeds of their own destruction. It was a double-edged sword, much like the one that ended Aemond's life. As you sink deeper into your bed, imagine the stillness of the Riverlands at night. The stars reflecting in the surface of the God's Eye, the water so calm it looks like a sheet of black glass. Beneath that surface lies the history we've explored tonight. The bones of dragons, the armor of princes, and the secrets of a time when the sky was filled with wings. Aemond's story is a part of that stillness now. It is a story that has been told and retold, each time gaining a new layer of myth and legend. But at its heart, it is the story of a second son who wanted to be first, a boy who wanted to be a man, and a rider who wanted to be one with his dragon. The sapphire eye, the silver hair, the iron crown. These are the symbols of a life lived at the edge of possibility. Aemond Targaryen did not ask for the world to be the way it was, but he refused to be a victim of it. He took what he wanted, he fought for what he believed in, and he died facing his greatest challenge. There is a certain grim beauty in that, a sense of completion that few lives ever achieve. He was the Kinslayer, yes, but he was also the protector. He was the villain in one story and the hero in another, depending on who was telling the tale and which side of the dragon they were standing on. Now, let the details of the dates and the names begin to blur. The year 110, the year 120, the year 130. They are all just points on a map that you are no longer following. The names of the dragons, Vhagar, Caraxes, Meles, Arax, are just whispers in the wind. The political factions of the Greens and the Blacks have long since dissolved into the dust of the past. All that remains is the feeling of the story, the grand, sweeping arc of a life that touched the heavens and fell into the deep. The room you are in is safe and warm. The world of Aemond Targaryen is far away, locked behind the pages of history and the screen of your imagination. You are not a prince, you are not a rider, and you do not have to carry the weight of a kingdom. You only have to breathe, slowly and deeply. You only have to let go of the day and embrace the quiet of the night. The story is finished. The prince has fallen. The dragons have vanished. Sleep is the great equalizer, the place where kings and commoners alike find peace. Aemond Targaryen, for all his power and his fury, eventually found his way to this same silence. The God's Eye was his final bed, the water his final shroud. Let his story be the lullaby that leads you into your own rest. Let the flickering images of sapphire and flame be replaced by the soft, steady darkness of sleep. Think one last time of the boy on the beach at Driftmark, looking up at the stars and dreaming of the sky. That boy is at peace now. The man he became, the things he did, the choices he made, they are all part of a larger design that has already been woven. You are outside of that design, a silent observer who can now close their eyes and walk away. The lore is a journey, and tonight's journey has reached its destination. The embers of the Targaryen dynasty will always glow in the dark, a reminder of a time when magic was real and the world was wide and dangerous. But for tonight, the fire is just a warmth to keep you comfortable as you drift off. The Sapphire Eye is just a dream. The dragon's roar is just the sound of the wind outside your window. Everything is as it should be. The history is recorded, the story is told, and the night is yours. Rest now. Let the ancient history of Westeros fade into the background. Let the names of the kings and the battles disappear. There is nothing left to do but sleep. The journey through the life of Aemond Targaryen has come to an end, and a new, quiet journey into the world of dreams is beginning. You are ready. You are safe. You are tired. The Sapphire Eye is closed. The dragon has landed. The prince is still. The waters of the God's Eye are quiet. The dance is over. The fire is out. The world is dark and peaceful. Sleep. Just sleep. Let the weight of the lore carry you down into the softest parts of your mind, where the stories are just colors, and the history is just a feeling of being home. You have traveled through a century of blood and fire, and now you have arrived at the shore of a quiet sea. Step into the water, let it be warm and welcoming, and let it carry you away. Tonight, we have looked at the life of Aemond Targaryen. We have seen his birth, his struggle, his triumph, and his fall. We have walked through the halls of the Red Keep and flown through the storms of the Riverlands. We have felt the cold of the sapphire and the heat of the dragon's breath. And now, we leave it all behind. The script is finished, the words have been spoken, and the only thing that remains is the silence. May your dreams be peaceful, may your rest be deep, and may you wake refreshed, far from the shadows of the one-eyed prince. In the year 110, after the conquest, a boy was born who would never quite belong to himself. He entered the world as the third child of King Viserys I and Queen Alicent Hightower, a prince in a kingdom that already had too many princes and not enough thrones. They named him Aemond, a strong Targaryen name, but from the very beginning, his place in the family was measured by what he was not. He was not the firstborn son. That was Aegon, the golden child, the heir apparent in everything but official decree. He was not the favoured heir of the realm. That was Rhaenyra, the king's daughter from his first marriage, a woman named successor over all men. And he was not the daughter who brought softness and joy to the court. That was Helaena, his younger sister, gentle and strange. Aemond was simply the spare, a second son in a dynasty obsessed with the line of succession, a line that seemed to bend away from him at every turn. From the moment he could understand the world around him, Aemond felt the weight of a shadow that was not his own. His brother Aegon moved through the Red Keep with a careless arrogance, surrounded by whispers that he might one day take the crown despite their father's wishes. Even as a child, Aegon was indulged, his flaws excused, his temper forgiven. Meanwhile, Rhaenyra stood at the center of the court, her father's pride made manifest, her every word carrying the gravity of a future queen. And Aemond, he was the son who stood in the margins, watching, learning, and burning with a quiet fire that no one seemed to notice. The psychological toll of being a spare in a family built on dragons and prophecy cannot be overstated. In the Targaryen household, your worth was often measured by the dragon you rode, or the egg that was placed in your cradle. For Aemond, That cradle held no promise. When he was born, no dragon egg was laid beside him, no tiny scaled creature waiting to hatch and bond. It was an omission that cut deeper than any harsh word. The other children had their eggs, Rhaenyra's sons. Even the bastards whispered about in the corners. Each had a dragon, or a chance at one. But Aemond was left with nothing but the cold knowledge that he had been overlooked. That lack, that sense of inadequacy, took root in the deepest part of his soul. He watched his brother Aegon claim a dragon, watched Rhaenyra's sons mount their own beasts, and he felt the sting of being less than. It was not a passive feeling, it was a gnawing hunger, a drive to prove that he was worthy of the name Targaryen, worthy of the blood that ran in his veins. But how does a child prove his worth when the world has already decided he is not the one? The court of King Viserys was not a kind place for a second son. The king was old and weary, more concerned with keeping the peace between his wife and his heir than with the inner life of his middle child. Alicent, Aemond's mother, was a woman of fierce ambition and deep insecurity. She poured her hopes into Aegon, grooming him for a crown that might never come, and she saw in Aemond a tool, a weapon to be sharpened. But a tool does not feel, a weapon does not dream, and Aemond dreamed of fire, of flight, of a moment when he would no longer be the shadow, but the one casting it. He grew up in a world where every glance, every whispered conversation, reminded him of his place. The greens and the blacks were already forming, the court splitting along lines that would one day drown the realm in blood. But for now, it was just children playing at politics. Aegon drank and whored and laughed. Rhaenyra sulked and plotted, and flew high above the clouds. And Aemond studied. He read histories of old Valyria. He practiced swordplay until his hands bled. He waited, because deep down he knew that a second son is only a spare until the first one falls. But before that fall could happen, there was a hole in his chest that needed filling. A dragon, he thought, would fill it. A dragon would make him whole. He watched Vhagar from afar, the ancient beast that had once carried Queen Visenya, a creature of legend who had outlived her rider and now slept in the sun, waiting for someone bold enough to claim her. Aemond knew that dragon was meant for him, but the path to Vhagar would cost him an eye, and with it, the last shred of innocence he might have possessed. But that is a story for another moment. To understand what drove Aemond, we must first understand the world that shaped him, a world where a mother's ambition and a father's neglect forged a weapon out of a child. That story, the story of the Hightower Influence and how it bent the entire dynasty toward fire, is where we turn next. From the moment of his birth in 110, after the conquest, Aemond Targaryen existed in a world of shadows. The shadow of his elder brother Aegon, the golden firstborn son who would one day wear the crown, and the shadow of his half-sister Rhaenyra, the named heir who stood as a living challenge to everything the Hightower family believed. But among those shadows, the longest and most defining was cast by his mother, Queen Alicent. And it was in the quiet hours of the Red Keep, in the small chambers where she would teach her children the truths of the realm, that Aemond first learned to see his half-sister not as family, but as a threat. Alicent Hightower was a woman shaped by duty and faith. She had grown up in Old Town, the ancient seat of the Faith of the Seven, and the centre of Andal culture in Westeros. Her father, Sir Otto Hightower, served as Hand of the King, and he had raised her with a deep reverence for tradition, for the laws of gods and men, as written in the sacred texts. When she came to court as a girl of 15 to comfort the grieving king after the death of his first wife, she carried with her the values of Old Town, order, piety, and the unshakable belief that the throne must pass to the eldest trueborn son. These were not just opinions, they were the very fabric of her identity, and when she became queen, she instilled those values in her children with every bedtime story, every lesson in the Sept, every whispered warning about the dangers of Valyrian exceptionalism. The divide between the two cultures was stark. The Targaryens had come from old Valyria, a dragon-lord empire built on blood magic, polygamy, and a belief in their own divine right to rule above all other men and women. They practiced incestuous marriage to keep their bloodline pure, they followed their own gods, and they treated the Faith of the Seven as little more than a convenient servant. For a devout woman like Alicent, this was not simply foreign. It was sinful. And when King Viserys named his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir over his son Aegon, it confirmed her deepest fears. The Valyrian way, with its disregard for tradition, was threatening to tear apart the very order that kept the realm stable. Aemond absorbed these lessons with a hunger that surprised even his mother. Where Aegon was indulgent, lazy, and quick to dismiss any talk of duty, Aemond listened. He asked questions, sharp, penetrating questions that showed a mind eager to understand the mechanics of power. Why was Rhaenyra chosen when Aegon was older? Did the king not see that his bastard sons were not real Targaryens? How could the lords of Westeros accept a woman on the Iron Throne when the gods themselves had decreed the primacy of men? Alicent would answer, her voice calm but her eyes burning with conviction. She taught him that the realm was a fragile thing, held together by rules that had been tested for thousands of years. Break those rules, she warned, and the realm would break with them. It was in these private conversations that the Green faction began to take shape, not as a formal alliance, but as a quiet gathering of like-minded souls in the Queen's solar. Lord Larys Strong, the Master of Whisperers, would visit with reports of Rhaenyra's movements and the whispers of discontent among the lords. Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, would stand guard at the door, his resentment toward Rhaenyra's champions boiling just beneath the surface, and young Aemond would sit in the corner, listening, memorizing, learning the names of the men who might one day support his brother's claim. He saw how his mother wielded influence not through dragons or steel, but through words, through favors, through the patient cultivation of loyalty. It was his first real lesson in the Game of Thrones. Meanwhile, the contrast between Aemond and his older brother grew more pronounced with every passing year. Aegon sought pleasure, wine, women, the thrill of the hunt, the easy laughter of the tavern. He avoided his lessons, sneered at his scepter, and treated the prospect of kingship as a tedious joke. Aemond, by contrast, threw himself into training with a ferocity that alarmed even the master-at-arms. He rose before dawn to practice sword and shield, studied the histories of Westeros and the Freehold, and spent long hours in the dragon pit, watching the beasts with a reverence that bordered on obsession. Where Aegon was soft, Aemond was steel. Where Aegon was careless, Aemond was calculating. And while the court whispered that the crown should pass to the elder son, it was the younger who began to draw the attention of those who valued strength over birthright. Queen Alicent watched these developments with a mixture of pride and concern. She saw in Aemond the son she had hoped Aegon would be, disciplined, dutiful, loyal to the faith and the family. But she also saw something dangerous in his intensity, a hunger that could not be satisfied by lessons alone. He wanted to prove himself, not just as a prince, but as something more. And she knew that the path to greatness in this family was paved with dragonfire. It is often said that the dance of the dragons began with a crown, or with a death, or with a choice. But for Aemond, it began much earlier, in the quiet of his mother's shadow, in the stories she told, in the resentment she planted. He did not yet hate Rhaenyra's sons with the burning rage that would define his later years. But the seeds were already there, buried deep in the soil of his upbringing, and upon that soil, the next great precipitating event would fall like a spark into dry kindling. The incident would become legendary, a childhood prank gone wrong that would echo through the ages and cement the enmity between the two branches of the family. It is known to history as the Pink Dread. Queen Alicent Hightower had done her work well. By the time Aemond Targaryen was a boy of 7 or 8, he understood exactly where he stood in the pecking order of the Red Keep. His mother had taught him to see Rhaenyra as a rival, a threat to her own children's future, and to view the princess's sons as illegitimate pretenders. But lessons whispered in the quiet of a mother's chambers are one thing. The brutal reality of the training yard and the nursery is something else entirely. Aemond, for all his sharp mind and fierce pride, was the youngest of the 3 true-born sons of Viserys, and the least noticed. His older brother Aegon was the firstborn son, the Golden Prince, even if he was lazy and cruel. Aegon had his own dragon, Sunfire, a creature of breathtaking beauty. He had the weight of expectation, even if he shirked it. And then there were Rhaenyra's sons, Jacaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey. They were younger than Aegon, but older than Aemond, and they had dragons too, Bermax, Arax and Tyraxes, hatchlings from the dragon pit. They rode them with the easy confidence of children who had never known doubt. Aemond, by contrast, had no dragon. He was the son of a king, a prince of the blood, and yet he was the only one of his generation who remained dragonless. It was a wound that festered in silence. The cruelty of children is a peculiar thing. It does not require a grand scheme. It is often born of boredom, of a desire to see who can be made to flinch first. And so it was on a warm afternoon, in the year 120 after the conquest, in the stone corridors of the Red Keep, that the seeds of a lifelong hatred were sown with something as simple, as grotesquely silly, as a pig. Aegon, for all his indifference to his younger brother, occasionally found amusement in taunting him. He had no true malice toward Aemond, or perhaps he did, but it was the lazy malice of a boy who knew he could get away with anything. On that day, Aegon orchestrated a prank. He and Rhaenyra's sons, Jacaerys and Lucerys, conspired together. They found a piglet from the castle kitchens, a squealing little creature, and they draped it in a rough cloth that might have passed for a saddlecloth. Then they presented it to Aemond with mock solemnity. "Here," Aegon said, his voice dripping with false generosity, "your very own dragon. We thought you might like one, since you haven't got one of your own. This one is called the Pink Dread." The name was a cruel joke. It mocked the great dragons of House Targaryen, Rhaegar the Bronze Fury, Meraxes, Valerian the Black Dread. To call a pig the Pink Dread was to say that Aemond was not worthy of a real dragon, that he was fit only for a child's toy, a pathetic imitation. Jacaerys and Lucerys laughed. Lucerys, the youngest of Rhaenyra's sons, laughed the loudest. Aemond stood there, his face burning, his hands clenched at his sides. He did not cry. He did not run to his mother. He swallowed the humiliation like a stone and made a silent vow that would echo through the rest of his life. That prank was more than a cruel game. It was a declaration. It told Aemond that he was an outsider among his own cousins, that they saw him as lesser, as a figure of mockery, and it forged a wedge between him and Rhaenyra's sons that would never be healed. From that day forward, Aemond did not merely dislike them, he began to hate them, and the object of his most intense loathing became Lucerys Velaryon, the boy who had laughed the loudest. Aemond's mother, Queen Alicent, tried to soothe his wounded pride. She told him that he would have a dragon one day, that it was only a matter of time, that the strongest dragons often chose their riders when the riders were ready. But Aemond was not soothed. He was finished with waiting. He was finished with being the one left behind. The humiliation of the Pink Dread burned in him like a fever. It drove him to study the histories of the great dragons, to memorize the locations of the wild and riderless beasts, to train in the yard with an intensity that surprised even the master-at-arms. The sensitive child, who had once sought his mother's approval, began to harden. He stopped complaining about small slights. He stopped asking for justice. He became quiet, watchful, calculating. The boy who had been mocked with a pig was slowly dying inside, and in his place emerged something colder, something more determined. Aemond Targaryen would never be mocked again. He would prove himself. He would claim a dragon so mighty that no one would ever dare laugh at him again. And so his obsession began. He waited, he planned, and he waited some more. The day would come, he knew, when an opportunity would present itself. He just had to be ready to seize it. But before that day could arrive, the family would be called together for a somber occasion, a death in the family, a funeral at Driftmark, and there, in the shadow of grief, Aemond would make a choice that would change everything. The humiliation of the Pink Dread was not merely a childish prank. It was a wound that festered in the dark corners of Aemond Targaryen's young heart. For a boy who already felt invisible, overshadowed by his elder brother Aegon, dismissed by his father the king, and mocked by the sons of Rhaenyra. That mockery carved a deep groove of resentment, and resentment in the Targaryen blood as a way of growing into something far more dangerous than bitterness. It becomes ambition. That ambition would find its first real stage in the year 120 after the conquest, at a place called Driftmark. The occasion was a funeral, the passing of Lyanna Velaryon, the wife of Prince Aemond Targaryen. Lyanna had died in childbirth, her body failing her after a long and difficult labour. She was only in her 20s, a dragon rider of Varga, the largest living dragon in the world, and her death sent ripples through the already fractured royal family. Now, funerals in the Seven Kingdoms are rarely simple affairs. They are gatherings of power, of alliances, of old wounds barely scabbed over, and this one, held at the ancient Velaryon fortress of High Tide on the island of Driftmark, was no exception. King Viserys I Targaryen decreed that the entire royal family should attend, to pay their respects to House Velaryon and to honour the memory of Lyanna. But in doing so, he forced the two factions of his own blood, the Greens and the Blacks, into the same halls, the same chambers, the same long nights of mourning. From the moment their ships docked, the tension was as thick as the sea fog rolling in from the narrow sea. Queen Alicent and her children, Aegon, Helaena, and Aemond, arrived in a procession of green velvet and silver, their every step a statement of their claim. Across the courtyard, Princess Rhaenyra and her husband, Prince Daemon, stepped ashore with their own retinue, their banners black and red, their faces carved from stone. Daemon, still raw with grief for Lyanna, wore his sorrow like a blade. Rhaenyra, heavy with child, walked with the weight of a throne she believed was hers by right, and between them, the children watched. Jacaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey, Rhaenyra's sons, stood close to their mother, their eyes darting toward the Greens. Aegon, the eldest of Alicent's brood, wore a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. Helaena kept her gaze on the ground, muttering words only she could hear. And Aemond, 10 years old, stood apart from them all, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the stone walls of Driftmark. For Aemond, this was not merely a funeral, it was an opportunity. He had heard the whispers. He knew that Lyanna Velaryon had ridden Varga, the dragon that had once carried Queen Visenya into battle, the beast that had burned the Field of Fire, the largest and most fearsome creature alive. And now that dragon had no rider, Aemond had been denied a dragon of his own for years. His cradle egg had never hatched, and every attempt to claim a hatchling had ended in failure. He had watched his siblings and cousins bond with their dragons, while he remained on the ground, powerless. But Vargar was riderless, and Driftmark, the ancient seat of the Velaryons, was where the great she-dragon now roamed, alone and grieving. The strategic importance of Driftmark in that moment cannot be overstated. It was the heart of Velaryon power, a fortress built on a wind-scoured island, its halls lined with tapestries of sea serpents and dragons. It was also neutral ground, or as neutral as any place could be when the Greens and Blacks shared the same roof. The funeral rites stretched over several days, with feasts and prayers and long silences. But beneath the surface of propriety, the air crackled with unspoken threats. Aemond watched. He listened to his mother's quiet conversations with Lord Corlys Velaryon, to his father's laboured breathing as he shuffled through the corridors, and he knew that if he was ever going to rise above the shadow of his brother, if he was ever going to silence the laughter of Rhaenyra's sons, he would have to take a risk that no one else would dare. The night of the funeral, after the torches had burned low and the castle had settled into an uneasy quiet, Aemond slipped away. He knew where Vargar was. She had been seen resting on the cliffs to the north, her massive form half hidden by the mist. He did not tell anyone where he was going. He did not ask for permission. He simply walked out into the salt wind, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind fixed on a single impossible goal. That walk would change everything. It would set in motion a chain of violence and blood that would define his entire life. But for now, in the darkness of Driftmark,
A 10-year-old boy was about to attempt the greatest gamble of his age, to tame the hoary vengeance of the oldest living dragon in the world. The funeral at Driftmark had barely concluded, the salt wind still carrying the cries of mourners as the royal family gathered in the great hall of high tide. Laena Velaryon was gone, her body given to the sea, and with her passing, the largest dragon in the world had no rider. Vhagar, the bronze beast of the conquest, the she-dragon who had carried Queen Visenya into battle, now lay restless upon the shores of Driftmark, her fires banked but her fury undimmed. For a 10-year-old boy named Aemond Targaryen, this was an opportunity he could not ignore. He had spent the evening watching the adults argue. His father, King Viserys, weak and weary, had forbidden any of the children from claiming Vhagar. The dragon was to remain riderless, perhaps out of respect for Luina, perhaps to avoid further inflaming the tensions between the Greens and the Blacks. But Aemond had heard the whispers. He had seen the way his half-sister Rhaenyra's sons, Jacaerys and Lucerys, looked at him. They had mocked him with a pig, called him a fool. In his heart, he burned with the need to prove himself. And what better proof than to tame the beast that had once been the terror of the Seven Kingdoms? That night, while the castle slept, Aemond slipped out of his chambers. The hour was deep and black, the moon hidden behind clouds. He wore no armour, carried no weapon, only the thin clothes on his back, and a determination that would not be denied. The path to the beach was long and winding, and the sand shifted beneath his feet. As he approached the place where Vhagar had made her lair, the sound of her breathing was like the rumble of distant thunder, deep and rhythmic, shaking the very ground. Aemond's heart pounded, but he did not turn back. He saw her then, a mountain of scales and shadow, curled like a great hill in the darkness. Her head rested on her forelegs, and one eye, the size of a shield, slowly opened. It gleamed like molten gold, and it fixed upon the small figure standing before her. Aemond knew this was the most dangerous moment of his life. Vhagar was not a tame dragon. She was ancient, wild, and had already devoured more men than any living creature. The air grew hot and acrid with the smell of smoke and sulphur. She let out a low hiss that vibrated in Aemond's bones. But he did what no child should have done. He spoke to her. In High Valyrian, the tongue of his ancestors, he called her name, softly at first, then with more force. He told her that he was a Targaryen, that he had come to claim her as his own. He reminded her that she had once carried a queen, and that he would be worthy of that legacy. Vhagar rumbled, and her head lifted, casting a shadow that swallowed the world. Aemond reached out his hand, palm open. The great jaws opened, revealing teeth as long as swords, and Aemond could feel the heat of her breath on his skin. For a long, terrible moment, the dragon simply stared. Then slowly, she lowered her head and let him touch her snout. It was a gesture of acceptance, a bond formed not by force but by something deeper. Aemond climbed onto her back, his small body dwarfed by the ridges of her spine. He took hold of the harness, and Vhagar rose, her wings unfurling like the shadows of a thunderhead. The ground trembled, and the night sky filled with the sound of leather and wind. Aemond had done it. He had tamed the hoary vengeance, the dragon of the conquest, the ultimate weapon of war. When the sun rose over Driftmark, the news spread like wildfire. The Greens celebrated, the Blacks fumed, and the balance of power in Westeros shifted forever. But for Aemond, this moment was also the beginning of a curse. The dragon that had accepted him would one day demand a price no child could imagine. And in the years to come, that price would be measured in blood, fire, and the grinding of bone. Up next, we explore what happens when a boy who dared to claim dragon learns that some bonds cannot be undone. That is Chapter 6, The Price of a Dragon. The dawn broke cold and grey over Driftmark, and by the time the rest of the castle stirred, the great dragon Vhagar was no longer riderless. A 10-year-old boy had done what grown men had failed to do for decades. Aemond Targaryen had claimed the beast of the conquest, the largest living creature in all the known world, and he had done it alone, in the dark, with nothing but his own will and a dragon saddle he barely knew how to fasten. But But the victory was not sweet for long. As Aemond descended from Vhagar's back, shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion, his cousins were waiting, and they were not alone. The Velaryon boys, Rhaenyra's sons, had been watching from the shadows. Jacaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey had seen everything. They had seen Aemond climb onto Vhagar, seen the ancient dragon accept him, seen the impossible become reality, and they were furious, because Vhagar, they believed, was rightfully theirs. She had been Laena Velaryon's dragon, and Laena had been their mother's cousin. The dragon belonged to their family, not to Alicent Hightower's son. What happened next was not a formal duel. It was not a knightly contest. It was a brutal, desperate brawl between children, fought in the shadows of the dragon's lair, with salt spray and sand beneath their feet and the sound of the sea crashing against the rocks below. Aemond was older than the Velaryon boys by a few years, and he was strong for his age, but he was outnumbered 3-1. Jacaerys came at him first, fist swinging, and Aemond met him with a fury that surprised even himself. He threw the older boy to the ground, pinned him there, and for a moment it seemed the fight was over. But then Lucerys struck him from behind, and Joffrey joined in, and the brawl became a storm of limbs and shouts, and the wet sound of flesh hitting flesh. Aemond fought back with everything he had. He was outmatched, but he refused to yield. He clawed, he bit, he screamed curses at them in High Valyrian, calling them bastards, taunting them with the truth that everyone in court whispered, but no one dared speak aloud. "Your father is a corpse," he snarled at them. "Your father is dead. You are Strongs, not Velaryons. You are bastards, every one of you." And that was when the fight became something else entirely. Lucerys Velaryon, the second son, the one who had always been quieter than his brothers, the one who carried the heaviest weight of his mother's expectations, reached out with his hand. He was not trying to kill. He was trying to stop. He was trying to make the words end. But in the chaos, in the frenzy, in the desperate scramble of a child who had been pushed too far, his fingers closed around something they should not have found. The knife was small, meant for cutting rope, not flesh, but it was sharp enough. Aemond did not see the blade coming. He felt it. A sudden, searing, impossibly white-hot pain erupted from the right side of his face, and the world collapsed into a single point of agony. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the sea. He tried to pull away, but Lucerys was holding on, and the knife was still moving. And then there was a wet, tearing sensation that Aemond would never forget for the rest of his life. When it was over, when the boys finally pulled apart, gasping and trembling, Aemond's right eye was gone, a gaping socket filled with blood, a wound that would never heal, a permanent scar carved into his face by the hand of his own cousin. The chaos that followed was not confined to the beach. It echoed through the halls of Driftmark, through the stone corridors of High Tide, up the stairs, and into the great chamber known as the Hall of Nine. The entire royal family was gathered there, summoned by the screams, drawn by the terrible news that spread like wildfire through the castle. The king had been awakened from his sickbed. The queen was already weeping, and in the centre of the room, standing between the two factions, was a 10-year-old boy with a bloody cloth pressed to his face and a dragon's bond burning in his chest. The Hall of Nine became a courtroom that night. The Greens and the Blacks faced each other across the stone floor, and the air was thick with accusation. Queen Alicent demanded justice. She demanded that Lucerys be punished, that the boy who had taken her son's eye be made to pay. She pointed at Rhaenyra, her voice shaking with rage, and declared that this was what came of raising bastards as heirs. This was what came of lying to the realm. This was what came of pretending that the truth was not the truth. But Rhaenyra would not yield. She stood beside her sons, her face pale and hard, and she spoke the words that would fracture the family forever. She reminded the court that Aemond had called her sons bastards. She reminded them that he had claimed Vhagar against the king's express command. She reminded them that her boys had been defending their honour, their mother's honour, their very right to exist. And then she asked the question, that no one wanted to answer. What, she demanded, would you have me do? Would you have me blind my own son in return? King Viserys, frail and failing, tried to broker peace. He commanded that the matter be dropped. He declared that no further punishment would be given. He ordered his family to reconcile, to forgive, to move forward as one house united. But the damage was already done. The wound was already carved, and the words that had been spoken in that hall could never be unspoken. Aemond stood silent through most of it. He listened to his mother rage. He listened to his father plead. He listened to Rhaenyra defend her own. And he listened to the whispers that followed him out of the hall. The murmurs of pity and horror, and barely concealed satisfaction. He had claimed Vagar, yes. He had achieved what no one else could. But he had paid for it with half his sight, and the price would only grow steeper with time. Later that night, when the castle had finally fallen quiet and the candles had burned low, someone asked Aemond if he regretted it, if he wished he had never climbed onto Vagar's back, if he wished he had stayed in bed and let the dragon belong to someone else. He looked up with his one remaining eye, and his voice was steady. I lost an eye, he said, but I gained a dragon. And in that moment, the child who had been a second son, a forgotten prince, a boy shaped by shadows and scorn, began to become something else, something harder, something colder, something that would one day burn through the Riverlands and carve a path of ash. The healing of a wound leaves a mark, and some marks are more than scars. They become emblems. When the Valyrian princes finally let Aemond go, the 10-year-old boy was carried from the driftwood throne room, not as a conqueror but as a casualty. His face was a ruin of blood and torn flesh, and the socket where his right eye had been was a hollow, throbbing void. The maesters of Driftmark worked through the night, their silver instruments glinting under candlelight, stitching the torn lids shut and packing the wound with honey-soaked linens to ward off corruption. But no poultice could restore what was gone, and no potion could ease the cold fire of humiliation that burned in the prince's chest. For weeks afterward, Aemond lay in the royal apartments of the Red Keep, swathed in bandages, his remaining eye fixed on the canopy above. His mother, Queen Alicent, rarely left his side, her hand clutching a damp cloth that she pressed to his forehead when the fever spiked. The pain was constant, a sharp pulsing ache that radiated into his skull and teeth. But worse than the physical agony was the silence that followed. His father, King Viserys, had refused to punish Lucerys. The king's words still rang in Aemond's ears. He is but a child, and he was afraid. A child, afraid. As if that excused the theft of an eye. As if that justified the permanent scar that would now define his face. The maesters warned of infection, of the possibility that the damage might spread, that the prince might lose more than an eye. But Aemond's body was obstinate, his will already iron hard. The wound closed, the swelling receded. And one morning, when the bandages were removed for the final time, the maester held a polished silver hand mirror before the boy's face. Aemond stared at his own reflection, a stranger with a pale, puckered line where his right eye had been. The lids sewn shut in a permanent, knowing squint. He did not weep. He did not rage. He simply set the mirror down and asked for a piece of felt and some thread. It was in this moment that the sapphire was conceived. The story is that Aemond, unsatisfied with the hollow darkness of his empty socket, demanded that something be placed there. Something that would not merely hide the void, but transform it into a statement. The court jewellers were summoned. A Cabochon sapphire, deep as a storm sea, was cut to the exact size of his missing eye. It was set into a thin silver backing with a tiny hook that could be fitted behind the lid. The first time he wore it, the court gasped. The gem caught the torchlight and glowed with an eerie internal fire, giving his face an otherworldly intensity. He was no longer just a scarred prince. He was Aemond One Eye, and the sapphire was his challenge to the world. Here is what you took. Now watch what I become. The silver eye patch that he often wore over it became his visual signature, a crescent of polished metal that arched from temple to cheekbone, held in place by a black leather strap. It was not merely practical, it was a symbol. The silver mirrored the scales of Vargar, the dragon he had claimed that same night. It was the colour of a blade drawn in moonlight, of the Conqueror's crown that he would one day wear. Every time someone saw that glinting patch, they remembered the story. A child who had dared to tame the oldest dragon, who had been mutilated for his ambition, and who had turned that mutilation into armour. The patch did not hide his injury, it announced it. And with that announcement came a shift in the way others perceived him. The whispers changed. Where once the court spoke of Aemond as the second son, the bookish prince, the one overlooked in favour of his older brother Aegon, now they spoke of him in hushed, wary tones. The Sapphire Eye seemed to see through people. It never blinked. It never betrayed emotion. It was a cold, unyielding gaze that made even grown knights look away. Children of the court, especially Rhaenyra's sons, avoided him. Lucerys would cross entire hallways to keep distance, his own eyes fixed on the floor whenever Aemond passed. It was during this period of recovery and transformation that Aemond's martial training intensified. His father, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of a desire to see his son hardened for the dangerous world ahead, assigned Sir Criston Cole as his personal swordmaster. Criston Cole was no ordinary knight. He was the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, a man forged in the Dornish marches, whose skill with a blade was matched only by his rigid loyalty to Queen Alicent's faction. He was cold, methodical and unforgiving. He saw in Aemond a raw material that could be shaped into a weapon. Under Cole's tutelage, Aemond rose before dawn each day. He trained in the yards until his hands bled and his legs gave out. He learned the sword, the shield, the spear, the dagger. He learned to fight with his weaker side, compensating for the lost depth perception by turning his head sharply, by feeling the rhythm of an opponent's breath, by reading the intent in their shoulders before their blade moved. Cole did not coddle him. When Aemond fell, Cole kicked him back up. When Aemond complained, Cole gave him extra laps around the training yard. And when Aemond finally landed a blow on the Lord Commander, a bruising strike to the ribs on a rainy afternoon, Cole simply nodded and said, again, the training was not just about strength, it was about control. Aemond learned to channel his hatred into precision. Every day, when he looked in the mirror and saw the Sapphire Eye staring back, he thought of Lucerys. He thought of the night on Driftmark, the shove, the sudden blinding pain, the laughter of the Velaryon boys echoing in his memory. That laughter had become a soundtrack in his skull, and he played it over and over during the grueling drills. The hatred did not diminish with time. It crystallized. It became a motive, a driving force, a reason to push beyond exhaustion. Sir Criston Cole, whether he knew it or not, was not just training a prince. He was forging a Kinslayer. The scar on Aemond's face healed into a thin, pale line that ran from the outer edge of his right brow down to his jaw. It was not hideous, but it was permanent. It cut through the symmetry of his features, a reminder to everyone that this prince had been violated. He wore it like a badge. He stopped trying to angle his face to hide it. Instead, he began to look directly at people, letting the sapphire and the scar confront them together. It became a test. Few could hold his gaze. Those who could were either fearless or foolish. By the time he was 12, Aemond was already a formidable presence. He stood tall, his shoulders broad from hours in the yard, his movements deliberate and economical. The soft child who had once read histories of dragons in the library was gone. In his place stood a young man with a gemstone for an eye and a heart of flint. The court began to take notice. The Greens, his mother's faction, saw in him their fiercest champion. The Blacks saw a threat, and Lucerys Velaryon, the boy who had taken the eye, saw a mirror held up to his own future. The hatred between them was no longer a childish rivalry. It was a blood debt. Aemond owed Lucerys a debt that could only be paid in kind, and everyone in the Seven Kingdoms knew it. The only question was when the account would come due. But before that hour struck, Aemond had other debts to settle. He had a dragon to master, a kingdom to guard, and a brother to crown, he had to become something more than the scarred prince. He had to become the one-eyed terror that would define the dance of the dragons, and the man who would teach him not just the sword, but the art of war. The man who would stand beside him through the coming storm was waiting in the shadows of the training yard. That man was a scholar turned soldier, a maester's chain melted into a sword. His name was Orwyle, but that is a story for another night. The chapter that follows is called The Scholar and the Sword, and it will reveal how Aemond's mind was sharpened as keenly as his blade, how he learned to read the moves of men and dragons alike, and how the puppet masters of the court began to pull the strings that would lead to war. The sapphire settled into its socket, a stone that caught the light with an almost living gleam. For those who met Aemond in the months after Driftmark, the first thing they noticed was the eye, not the old one, lost to a boy's desperate slash, but the new one, a jewel that seemed to hold the cold fire of old Valyria itself. The silver eye patch he wore over it became as much a part of him as his dragon, a badge of pain and defiance. But what the court at King's Landing did not see was the transformation happening beneath the surface. The boy who had once chased a pig with a wooden sword was gone. In his place, a scholar was being forged in fire and silence. You see, the loss of an eye did not slow Aemond, it sharpened him. He threw himself into the library of the Red Keep with a ferocity that surprised even the maesters, while his brother Aegon drank and warred his way through the capital's dark corners. Aemond read. He devoured histories of the conquest, the crumbling scrolls of the freehold, the tactical treatises of ancient Essosi generals. He studied the campaigns of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters, learning how dragons had been used not just as weapons of terror, but as instruments of precise, overwhelming force. He memorized the lineage of every Targaryen who had ever lived, and he found patterns in their madness and their greatness. But Aemond was not content with mere dusty knowledge. He understood that the mind alone could not command respect in a world ruled by steel and fire, so he turned to the sword. Day after day, he trained with the master-at-arms, drilling until his muscles screamed and his single eye saw double. He practiced against multiple opponents, learning to compensate for the blind spot on his right side by using his other senses, the whisper of a blade through air, the shift of weight on flagstones. He studied the fencing manuals of Braavos, the long axes of the north, the curved sabres of the Dothraki. He did not just want to be competent, he wanted to be lethal. And then there was philosophy. Aemond read the works of the ancient philosophers of Lys and Volantis, those who had pondered the nature of power and duty. He found particular solace in the writings of a scholar named Gaemon the Gilded, who argued that a ruler must be both feared and respected, that compassion without strength was a waste. Aemond internalized this. He began to see himself not as a second son, but as the true heir to the Conqueror's legacy. While Aegon stumbled through the court's endless feasts, vomiting wine and fathering bastards, Aemond stood tall in the training yard, his blade flashing, his sapphire eye glowing with a terrible certainty. This was the contrast that defined the Green faction in those years. The capital was drowning in decadence. King Viserys grew ever more frail, his body rotting from the inside, and his attention drifted. The court became a marketplace of whispers and schemes. Alicent Hightower tried to maintain order, but her hands were tied by a husband who refused to see the truth. And in the midst of this decay, Aemond cultivated himself. He became a fortress of discipline in a city of excess. He stopped attending feasts unless they served a purpose. He spoke only when he had something worth saying, and when he looked at his brother Aegon, he saw a crown that was being worn by the wrong head. The growing belief that he, not Aegon, was the brother truly fit to rule did not come from vanity. It came from observation. Aemond watched as Aegon shirked every duty, as he sneered at the small council, as he treated his crown like a toy, and he watched as Rhaenyra's faction grew bolder, knowing that the throne would pass to a woman who, in their eyes, had no right to it. Aemond could not abide that. He believed in the primacy of the male line, Yes, but more than that, he believed in strength, and strength he knew was not born, it was forged. He had forged himself in the fire of his own suffering, so he became the most dangerous member of the Green faction, not through brute force alone, but through a combination of intellect and skill that no one else could match. He knew the history of every lord, the weaknesses of every house, the exact moment to strike. He could recite the terms of every treaty from the past 100 years. He could disarm a knight twice his age with a feint that cost him nothing but a breath. And he could ride Vargar, the oldest and largest dragon in the world, as if they shared one mind. This was the scholar and the sword united in a single purpose. The court noticed. Whispers began to circulate that Prince Aemond was the one to watch. Some said he had the look of a conqueror, that his silver hair and sapphire eye reminded them of the old portraits of Maegor the Cruel. Others said he had the cold patience of a strategist, that he could read the battlefield before it was drawn. But no one said he was weak. No one ever called him a boy again. And yet, for all his knowledge and skill, Aemond carried a wound that had not healed. The memory of Lucerys Velaryon, the boy who had taken his eye, burned in his chest like a coal that would never cool. Every time he looked into a mirror, the sapphire stared back at him, a constant reminder of the debt that remained unpaid. He had learned to channel that rage into discipline. But he had not forgotten. He waited. He planned, and he knew that the day would come when the scholar would close his books and the sword would taste blood. But before that day, there would be words. In the great hall of the Red Keep, at a feast meant to mend the fractures of the family, Aemond would rise and speak, and his words would cut deeper than any blade. The strong toast was coming. By the time Aemond had finished his training with the swordmasters of the Red Keep, he was not merely a prince of the blood. He was a weapon. His mind had been sharpened by histories and philosophies, his body hardened by countless hours in the yard, and his spirit forged in the fire of a single, unhealed wound. The sapphire that now sat in his eye socket was a constant reminder of what he had lost and what he would never forgive. But all that training, all that study, had been for a purpose that had not yet fully revealed itself. He needed a stage, and in the 127th year after the conquest, the stage was set. That year, King Viserys, frail and weary from decades of rule, made a final, desperate attempt to mend the fracture that had split his family in two. He called for a great banquet in the Red Keep, a feast meant to reconcile the Greens and the Blacks, to force his wife and his daughter, his sons and his grandsons, to sit at the same table and remember that they were all Targaryens. The hall was draped in the red and black of the dragon banner, the great table laden with roasted meats and sweet wines, and the air thick with the scent of burning tallow and forced politeness. It was a performance, of course. Everyone knew it. The smiles were tight, the laughter hollow, and the looks exchanged between the two sides carried the weight of a decade of resentment. Viserys himself presided over the feast, his body a shell of what it had once been. He had lost much of his sight, and his hands trembled as he raised his cup. He spoke of unity, of blood, of the importance of standing together as a family. His words were sincere, but they fell on ears that had long since stopped listening. The king could not see the venom in his son's eyes, nor the cold fury in his daughter's. He could not see Aemond, seated near his brother Aegon, watching the proceedings with a predator's stillness. Aemond had been waiting for this night. He had not spent those years in the library and the training yard merely to become a better swordsman or a more learned scholar. He had been preparing for the moment when he could strike not with steel, but with words. Words that would cut deeper than any blade, because they would speak a truth that everyone in that hall knew but no one dared to utter. As the feast wore on and the wine flowed, the tension grew unbearable. It was Aemond who finally broke it. He rose from his seat, his silver eye patch catching the candlelight, and walked to the centre of the hall. He lifted a goblet, not in a toast to the king, but in a gesture aimed directly at Rhaenyra's sons, Jacaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey. His voice carried easily across the hall, smooth and deliberate, as if he had rehearsed the words 1,000 times. To the 3 strong boys, he said, "May your father be proud of you." The insult was surgical. Everyone present understood the implication. Rhaenyra's sons were widely believed to be bastards, fathered not by her husband Laenor Velaryon, but by her lover, Sir Harwin Strong. By calling them strong boys, Aemond was publicly branding them as illegitimate, as imposters, as a stain on the Targaryen name, and he had done it in front of the entire court. In front of the king, in front of their mother. The hall fell into a stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Jacaerys and Lucerys lunged at Aemond, their faces twisted with rage. Aegon rose to defend his brother. Cups were knocked over, plates shattered, and the carefully constructed peace of the evening dissolved into a brawl. Guards rushed in to separate the princes, but the damage was done. The family rift, which Viserys had hoped to seal with the feast, had been torn open and shown to be beyond repair. Viserys watched it all from his throne, his failing eyes unable to see the violence, but his ears filled with the shouts and the crashes. He cried out for order, but his voice was too weak to carry. He commanded his sons to stop, but they did not hear him. He was a king in name only now, a ghost presiding over the ruin of his own house. The banquet was ended. The guests dispersed in shame and fury, and the Red Keep returned to its tense, silent vigilance. But something had shifted. The insult had been spoken, and it could not be taken back. The war, which had been brewing for years beneath a veneer of courtly manners, was now inevitable. All that remained was the death of the king, and that death was not far off. Viserys' health had been declining for years, but after that night it seemed to accelerate. He retreated to his chambers, attended only by maesters and his wife Alicent. The realm watched and waited. The Greens began to move in the shadows, securing alliances and preparing for a coup. The Blacks did the same, fortifying their positions on Dragonstone. The dance of the dragons had not yet begun, but its first chord had been struck. Aemond, meanwhile, withdrew into himself. The insult at the banquet had been a victory, but it was not enough. He had humiliated Rhaenyra's sons, but he had not yet taken what he truly wanted. For that, he would need war, and soon war would come. The next chapter of this story is called The King is Dead, and it is a chapter that begins with the sound of bells tolling over King's Landing, and ends with a crown placed on a head that was never meant to wear it. The strong toast had been a calculated insult, but it was also a warning. Aemond had stood before the entire court, raising his cup to Rhaenyra's sons, Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey, and naming them the 3 strong boys. It was a phrase that cut to the heart of the succession crisis, a public admission of what everyone whispered in private, that these boys were not true Velaryons, not of dragon's blood in the male line, but bastards fathered by Sir Harwin Strong. The insult ignited a brawl that sent goblets flying and left Daemon laughing, while Viserys sat helpless on the throne, his final attempt at unity shattered. From that night forward, the Red Keep was a house divided, and the king's health began its slow, inexorable decline. King Viserys I Targaryen had reigned for over a quarter of a century, but by the winter of 129 after the conquest, the once proud monarch was a shell of a man. The iron lung from his youth had given way to a body ravaged by the slow poison of infection and grief. His face was a mask of weeping sores, his limbs trembling, his breath a rattling whisper. He spent his days in his chambers, attended only by his Grand Maester Orwyle and a handful of trusted servants, while Queen Alicent hovered at his bedside like a guardian angel or a jailer, depending on whose account you believe. And then, in the early hours of the 3rd moon of 129, the king drew his last breath. The passing of Viserys I was not announced immediately. It could not be. For years, the king had wavered between 2 oaths. The one he made to Rhaenyra, naming her his heir, and the one demanded by tradition, that a son should sit the Iron Throne. He had reaffirmed Rhaenyra's claim on his deathbed, or so the accounts from the Black faction claimed. But as the fire in his chambers flickered low and his hand went cold, Alicent Hightower made a choice that would ignite a war. She did not mourn. She acted. Within hours of the king's death, a small coterie of the most powerful men in the realm gathered in secret. This was the Green Council, named for the emerald silks Alicent had worn at the tournament that first announced the faction's existence. Its members were Lord Otto Hightower, the Queen's father and hand of the King, Sir Criston Cole, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Grand Maester Orwyle, Master of Coin Larys Strong, and Lord Jasper Wild, the Master of Laws. And there, seated at the table's far end, with his sapphire eye glinting in the candlelight, was Prince Aemond Targaryen. These men did not debate whether to honour Viserys' will. That question had been settled years ago. They discussed only one thing: how to ensure that Aegon, the eldest son, took the throne before Rhaenyra ever learned her father was dead. Every minute mattered. If word reached Dragonstone before the coronation, the Blacks would raise their banners and war would begin on their terms. The Green Council moved with cold efficiency, drafting decrees, locking gates, and positioning loyal soldiers at every strategic point in King's Landing. And no one was more vital to that operation than Aemond. His role in securing the Red Keep during those initial hours was absolute. He was not yet 20 years old, but he had already become the enforcer of the Hightower Cabal, the blade they would not hesitate to unsheathe. While the council debated the finer points of law and proclamation, Aemond took to the shadows. He began with the Gold Cloaks, the City Watch. Their commander, a man loyal to Daemon, was paid a quiet visit in his chambers. No one knows exactly what was said, but by dawn the watch had new orders. The gates of the city were sealed. No ravens were to fly without the Grand Maester's seal, and any messenger seen heading toward the coast was to be detained. Then Aemond moved to the Dragon Pit. The keepers were loyal to the crown. But which crown? He reminded them, with Vagar's shadow fooling the torchlit tunnels, that the largest dragon in the world was now the only riderless dragon in the city, and that he was not afraid to use her. Meanwhile, the Red Keep itself became a fortress of whispers. Servants were confined to their quarters. The Master of Whisperers, Larys Strong, ensured that every ear in the castle belonged to the Greens. Even the children were kept in ignorance. Helena was told nothing. Her twins, Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, played in the gardens as if the world were still whole, and Aegon, the reluctant heir, was found in a flea-bottom brothel, dragged back to Maegor's holdfast, and given a crown he had never wanted. But Aemond did not flinch. He'd spent his entire life preparing for this moment. The moment when the velvet glove of diplomacy would be stripped away, revealing the iron gauntlet beneath. He had studied the histories of Maegor the Cruel, of Aenys the Weak, of every king who had lost his throne through indecision. He would not allow his family to suffer that fate. Rhaenyra's claim was a ghost, a legal fiction. The realm needed a man on the Iron Throne, a dragon rider with fire in his blood. And so, with the king's body still warm in his bed, the Greens moved to crown their own sovereign. They did not wait for a grand sept, for the High Septon, for the ancient traditions of the faith. They crowned Aegon in the great hall of the Red Keep, with the Conqueror's crown of Aegon, the dragon placed upon his brow by Sir Criston Cole. The few lords present swore oaths in a ceremony that lasted barely an hour. The small folk of King's Landing would awaken to a new king, with no memory of the old one's passing, and at the centre of it all, standing just behind the throne, was Aemond, one eye of sapphire, one of steel. He had lost his eye for a dragon, and that dragon had made him the most dangerous man in the realm. As the crown settled upon Aegon's head, Aemond's lips curved into a smile that never reached his good eye. He knew what came next. The ravens would fly to Dragonstone, Rhaenyra would refuse, and the dance of the dragons would begin. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of a coup, he allowed himself a single moment of satisfaction. The king was dead. Long live the king. And yet, even as the cheers of the Green Council faded into the stone corridors, Aemond understood that this was only the first move in a game that would consume them all. The Queen Dowager, Alicent, had sealed the doors of the small council chamber and spoken to her father in hushed tones about the need to secure the Iron Bank, the free cities, the great houses of the realm. But Aemond had already begun to think beyond politics. He saw the war not as a contest of ravens and treaties, but as a dance of dragons, and he intended to lead the first charge. That secret council, now known to history as the Green Council's Gambit, would shape the fate of Westeros for generations to come. The choices made in those candlelit hours, the lie about the king's final words, the bypass Rhaenyra's claim, to place a reluctant drunkard on the throne, set in motion a tragedy that would drown the realm in blood and fire. But at the time, it seemed to Aemond like the only logical path. The Green Council's Gambit was a desperate roll of the dice, and Aemond was its most dangerous player. But the dragon above the God's Eye was already shifting in her sleep, and the hour of the wolf was drawing near. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The death of King Viserys I left a silence that seemed to press down on the Red Keep like a blanket of ash. In the hours after his passing, the Green Council convened in chambers, lit by flickering candles. Their voices kept low, their words sharpened by the knowledge that every moment of delay could tip the realm into chaos. The central question before them was not simply who would rule, but whether the law itself could be bent to serve their ambition. The debate over the legality of Aegon's succession versus Rhaenyra's was never a simple matter of precedent. For decades, Viserys had named his daughter as his heir, and the lords of the realm had sworn oaths to her. But the old king had also fathered sons, and in the eyes of many, a crown belonged to a man before a woman, especially when that man was the firstborn son of the king's second marriage. The Green Council, led by Queen Alicent and her father Ser Otto Hightower, argued that Viserys had been misled in his final years, that his naming of Rhaenyra was a product of grief and stubbornness, not sound judgment. They pointed to the Great Council of 101, which had chosen a male claimant over a female one, and insisted that tradition was a stronger foundation than a dying king's decree. But words alone could not secure a throne. Behind the legal arguments stood a far more tangible force, Aemond Targaryen, the one-eyed prince, who had become the primary enforcer of his mother's and grandfather's will. While Otto Hightower debated the finer points of succession with the maesters and lords, Aemond stood in the shadows, his silver eye patch catching the candlelight. He did not speak much in those meetings, but his presence was enough. He was the sharp edge of the Green Count's Gambit, the blade that would ensure their words were backed by dragonfire, and that blade was aimed squarely at his older brother. For the coronation to proceed, they needed Aegon II, but Aegon was nowhere to be found. While the council debated, servants and soldiers were dispatched into the sprawling underbelly of King's Landing, searching the taverns, the brothels, the forgotten corners where a prince might lose himself in cheap wine and cheaper company. The search for Aegon in the city's underbelly was a grim task, and Aemond volunteered for it with a cold eagerness that revealed more than he intended. He knew exactly where his brother would be, and the knowledge filled him with a quiet, simmering disdain. To Aemond, Aegon was a disappointment wrapped in a crown. The older prince had never shown any interest in duty, in history, in the weight of their family's legacy. He drank, he warred, he laughed at things that should have been serious. And now, when the realm needed a king, he was hiding in the filth of Flea Bottom. Aemond's disdain for his brother's lifestyle was not merely moral disapproval. It was the frustration of a man who had studied war and sacrifice, who had lost an eye and gained a dragon, only to see the throne offered to someone who had earned none of it. He walked the muddy streets, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. He wondered if his brother even understood what was about to happen. They found Aegon in a rat-infested cellar, half asleep and reeking of sour ale. He was dragged back to the Red Keep, stumbling and cursing, while Aemond watched with the cold patience of a predator. In the council chamber, the debate resumed, but now it had a target. Aegon sat slumped in a chair, his eyes glassy, while his mother and grandfather laid out the plan. They would crown him at dawn, they said. They would declare Rhaenyra a usurper. They would fight if they had to. The final decision to move forward with the coronation, despite the risk of civil war, was made not in the heat of passion, but in the cold calculus of power. Aemond cast the decisive vote, though it was hardly a vote at all. He simply looked at his brother and said, "The throne is yours, brother. Take it, or I will." There was no threat in his voice, only the certainty of a man who knew that if Aegon refused, there would be blood anyway, just a different kind. And so the Green Council set their gambit in motion, knowing that once the crown was placed on Aegon's head, there would be no turning back. The realm would split, dragons would burn the sky, and the dance would begin. The bells of the Great Sept would ring out the name of a new king, but the echo would carry the rumour of war. In the darkness before dawn, Aemond stood on a balcony overlooking the city, his one eye scanning the streets where lanterns still flickered, where the common folk slept unaware of the fire that was about to be lit. He did not smile, he did not frown. He simply waited, because he knew that tomorrow would be the last day of peace for a very long time. And when the sun rose on the coronation of Aegon II, the realm would never be the same. The night of King Viserys' death had been a storm of whispered counsels and hurried decisions, and by dawn, the Green faction had already set its plan into motion. Aemond Targaryen stood at the centre of that plan, not as a king, but as the iron fist that would guarantee his brother's reign. The realm was about to witness something the capital had not seen in decades. A crown placed on a head by force of will, not by the slow hand of inheritance. And Aemond, with his silver eye patch catching the first light of morning, would be the one to make that crown stay. The Dragon Pit was a cavern of ancient stone and living flame, a place where the Targaryen dynasty had once displayed its power to awe and terrify the masses. On the morning of Aegon II's coronation, that same cavern filled with a different kind of awe, uneasy, charged like the air before a storm. The great dome above echoed with the shuffle of hundreds of nobles, septons and small folk who had been allowed inside to witness the ceremony. Torches flickered along the walls, and from the high galleries, the dragons themselves could be heard, stirring in their lairs beneath the pit. It was a spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses, to remind every living soul in King's Landing that the blood of the dragon still ruled. And at the centre of that spectacle stood Aegon, dressed in black and gold, the Conqueror's crown resting on a cushion beside the high septon. Aemond entered not as a prince merely observing, but as a presence that shifted the mood of the room. He wore a dark leather tunic trimmed with green, and at his side hung the longsword he had trained with for years. His silver hair was pulled back, and his single violet eye swept across the gathered crowd with an intensity that made men look away. Behind him, the great doors groaned shut, sealing the coronation from the outside world and sealing the fate of the realm. He took his place to the left of the dais, directly beside his mother Alicent, who was already pale with the weight of what they had done. Together they watched as the High Septon anointed Aegon's brow with 7 oils, each drop a prayer to the gods of the faith. The crown was lifted, placed upon his head, and the roar that followed was not from the crowd, but from the depths of the dragon pit. Below, the dragons of the Greens, sensing the shift in power. Aegon was now king, crowned in the traditional way, with the full blessing of the faith and the support of the 3 great houses that had sworn for him: Hightower, Lannister, and Baratheon. But a crown alone does not command loyalty, it needs a sword. And as Aegon raised his hand to acknowledge the cheers, it was Aemond who stepped forward, unsheathing his blade in one smooth motion. The noise died. He knelt, not in submission but in pledge. I am your shield, your protector, your sword. His voice carrying through the vast chamber. From this day until my last, I will guard your reign with fire and blood, the crowd murmured. They had heard of this prince, the one who had claimed Varga as a boy, the one who wore a sapphire where his eye had been. Now they saw him rise, and the title was spoken aloud for the first time. Protector of the realm. The ceremony continued, with the traditional oaths, the presentation of the scepter, the shaking of hands with the lords, who had travelled from every corner of the realm. But even as the feasting began in the Red Keep, a darker understanding settled over those who had eyes to see. In the north, in the Vale, on Driftmark and Dragonstone, another queen was being crowned in the same hour. Rhaenyra Targaryen, the princess who had been named heir for 20 years, would never accept her half-brother's coronation. The realm was now split into two irreconcilable camps, and the line between them was drawn not in parchment but in blood. Aemond knew this better than anyone. He had already tested that line twice, once with his lost eye and again with the insult at the banquet. There would be no reconciliation, only war. But war requires more than a crown and a sword. It requires alliances, dragons and speed. That very afternoon, as the tables were still being cleared in the Great Hall, the green dragons began to mobilise. Sunfire, the golden dragon of the new king, was led out of the dragon pit to the awe of the crowds. Dreamfire, ridden by Queen Helena, circled above the city, pale the blue scales shimmering in the afternoon sun, and Varga, the ancient terror of the Conqueror's age, rose from her lair with a roar that shook the very foundations of Aegon's high hill. Aemond was already mounted, strapped into the saddle that had once carried Laena Velaryon, and he did not wait for orders. He knew what had to be done. The great houses of the realm were watching to see which hut side would prove stronger, and the Greens needed to secure their alliances before Rhaenyra could move. Aemond's first destination was not a battlefield, but a hall of stone and salt, a place where the fate of the Riverlands and the Stormlands would be decided by a single word of fealty. He had been chosen for this mission because he was the most feared, the most decisive, and the most willing to do what his brother could not. As Vhagar beat her wings and climbed above the rooftops of King's Landing, Aemond looked back once at the Red Keep, where the new king was already drinking himself into a stupor. The crown would not protect Aegon, Aemond would, and the first test of that protection would come at a place called Storm's End, where a boy named Lucerys Velaryon was already sailing toward the same stone walls. The coronation of Aegon II had been a spectacle of fire and stone, a declaration to all of Westeros that the Greens would not yield. But a crown is only as strong as the swords that defend it, and in the days that followed, every raven that left the Red Keep carried a single urgent message. Choose your side. King's Landing could claim the Iron Throne, but without the great houses of the realm, that claim was little more than a gilded threat. And so, Prince Aemond Targaryen, the newly anointed protector of the realm, was sent east to the shores of Shipbreaker Bay, to the ancient and storm-racked fortress of Storm's End. The mission was simple in design, though treacherous in execution. Lord Boros Baratheon, the Lord of Storm's End, and head of one of the oldest houses in the Seven Kingdoms, held the keys to the entire eastern seaboard. His fleet and his bannermen could tip the scales of war decisively. Aemond knew that his brother's cause needed more than just the support of the Crownlands and the Reach. It needed the raw, unbending strength of the Stormlands. And so, riding on the back of Vhagar, the ancient dragon whose wings could cast a shadow over an entire town, Aemond descended upon the round hall of Storm's End like a living legend. He did not come with a host of knights or a caravan of wagons. He came alone, save for a small honour guard, but he carried something far more valuable than gold or steel. He carried a promise. Lord Boros was a man known for his pride and his ambition, a man who had sired 4 daughters but no sons, and it was to this weakness that Aemond aimed his most careful blow. He offered a marriage pact, a binding of the blood of the dragon, to the blood of the storm, a son of Lord Boros's line, or, failing that, a daughter betrothed to a suitable green prince, would tie the Baratheon legacy to Aegon II's reign forever. The offer was generous, and Lord Boros listened. His great hall, with its high vaulted ceiling and the constant groan of wind against the stone walls, became the stage for a delicate dance of words and ambition. Aemond stood before the Lord of Storm's End, his silver eye patch gleaming in the torchlight, and laid out the terms with calm precision. The Stormlands would be rewarded, honoured, and raised high. In return, they would bend the knee to Aegon, and their swords would march for the Greens. For a moment, it seemed the matter would be settled. Lord Boros was impressed, perhaps even tempted, by the Dragon Prince's confidence. But then the doors of the Round Hall opened again, and a second messenger arrived. It was Lucerys Velaryon, the boy who had once stolen Aemond's eye. He came as an envoy for the Blacks, riding his young dragon Arax, bearing a letter from his mother, Rhaenyra, the self-proclaimed queen. And with that single entrance, the air in the hall changed. The warmth of negotiation turned to ice. For the first time in years, Aemond stood face to face with the boy who had maimed him. The scar beneath his eye patch seemed to pulse with a remembered pain. Lucerys, barely a man, stepped forward with all the nervous dignity of a child forced to play a warrior's role. He presented his mother's plea, asking Lord Boros to honour the oaths sworn to Rhaenyra years ago. But the words were lost, drowned by the weight of history between these two young princes. Aemond did not shout. He did not draw his sword, but his voice, when he spoke, carried the distant rumble of thunder. He reminded Lord Boros that the Blacks were the ones who had broken the peace first, that Rhaenyra had given her son a dragon to fly into the heart of green territory. And then, with a calm that was more terrifying than any rage, he turned his single, burning eye upon Lucerys and spoke of old debts, of blood, and of the eye that was owed. The Round Hall fell silent. The storm outside howled. Lord Boros, caught between two dragons and two queens, made his choice. He would not harm a messenger under his roof. That was the old law, a sacred guest right. But he would not protect Lucerys beyond the walls of Storm's End. The boy was dismissed, told to return to his mother. But as Lucerys mounted Arax and launched into the darkening sky, Aemond followed. He did not need to speak another word. His actions would become the story, and that story would be written in fire and blood. The events that unfolded above the churning sea, beneath the clouds of a gathering storm, would change the dance forever. They would earn Aemond, the name that would cling to him for all of history. A name that would be whispered with fear and loathing in every castle from the Wall to Sunspear. The next chapter of this war would be called A Storm of Blood, and it was about to break with a fury that no one, not even a dragon prince, could fully control. The offer had been made. Aemond Targaryen stood before Lord Boros Baratheon in the Great Hall of Storm's End, the wind howling against the stone walls as he presented the terms of the Green Alliance. A marriage pact, a binding of houses, the promise of the Stormland swords for his brother Aegon, the Second's cause. It was a gambit born of necessity, for the Greens knew that without the Baratheons, their hold on the realm would be brittle. But as Aemond spoke, his silver eye patch catching the torchlight, there was another presence in the hall, a smaller figure, young and nervous, standing in the shadows near the hearth. Lucerys Velaryon had arrived on a similar errand, sent by his mother Rhaenyra to secure the same alliance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the ages. Lord Boros listened to both envoys with a stony expression, his jaw tight beneath his thick beard. He was a man who valued strength above all, and he could see the power radiating from Aemond's coiled frame. But he was also a man who respected the ancient laws of hospitality. When the two princes began to exchange heated words, when Aemond's voice dropped to a venomous low, and his hand drifted toward his sword, Lord Boros rose from his seat with a thunderous command. He would not allow bloodshed under his roof. The hall fell silent. The tension that had been building for days, The hatred that had festered since the loss of an eye years before was forced to find another outlet. There would be no duel in the Great Hall, no quick and brutal end to the quarrel. The conflict would have to be settled elsewhere, beyond the shelter of stone and the watchful eyes of the Storm Lord. So Aemond turned on his heel, his cloak sweeping behind him as he strode toward the courtyard. The sky outside had darkened, heavy with the promise of a storm. Rain began to fall in sheets, driven by a wind that seemed to carry the distant scream of dragons. Lucerys, pale and trembling, followed at a distance. He knew what was coming. He had known it from the moment he saw Vargar's massive shape silhouetted against the clouds. The ancient dragon that had once carried Queen Visenya to war. Aemond mounted the beast with a practiced ease, his single eye fixed on the smaller figure below. Arrax, Lucerys' dragon, was barely half the size of Vargar, a young and agile creature, but no match for the ancient terror that now stirred beneath Aemond. There was no spoken challenge, no final ultimatum. The chase had already begun. Aemond urged Vhagar into the tempest, the great dragon's wings beating with a sound like thunder made flesh. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the terrifying scale difference between the two dragons. Vhagar's shadow swallowed the clouds, her form a mountain of scales and fury, while Arrax darted through the rain like a silver fish fleeing a leviathan. The storm raged around them, wind and rain and raw electricity, but Aemond saw only his quarry. He had waited years for this moment, the chance to repay the debt of blood that Lucerys had taken from him. The chase was not yet a hunt, not in those first frantic seconds. It was a demonstration of power, a warning meant to drive Lucerys into submission, to make him feel the weight of his insignificance. But the smaller dragon was fast, and the storm offered cover, and Aemond's patience had always been thin. The moment came when the chase turned from intimidation to a lethal hunt. It happened in a flash of lightning that revealed Lucerys' face, pale and terrified, looking back over his shoulder. Aemond saw that fear, and something inside him snapped. This was no longer about teaching a lesson or proving dominance. This was about finality. Vhagar responded to her rider's will, her jaws opening wide as she closed the distance. The storm swallowed the sound of Arrax's scream, but the lightning painted the scene in stark, frozen frames. Aemond's intent was no longer hidden. He would not let Lucerys escape. He would not let this debt remain unpaid. The hunt had become a slaughter, and the rain fell like tears from a sky that had witnessed too much. But what happened next, the moment of impact, the collision of fire and scale and fury, is a story for another chapter. For now, know that the storm above Storm's End was not merely a weather event. It was the herald of a blood debt that would never be settled, a death that would stain the Targaryen name forever. We'll explore that fateful encounter in the next chapter, as we turn to the event that earned Aemond the title of Kinslayer, the death of Lucerys. The storm had swallowed them both, but Aemond could still see the smaller dragon ahead, a dark shape flitting through the sheets of rain and lightning, like a wounded bird. Arrax was no match for Vhagar, not in size, not in speed, not in raw power that could crush castles. Yet Lucerys Velaryon did not surrender. He did not turn. Perhaps he believed the storm would hide him, or perhaps he simply refused to show fear before the one who had hated him since childhood. The wind howled across Vargar's wings, and the great beast responded to Aemond's command, or perhaps to its own instinct. Some would later argue that Vhagar acted on its own, that the ancient dragon, older than any living creature in Westeros, had tasted war before and recognized prey. Others insisted that Aemond gave the order, that his voice carried through the thunder, a single word that sealed his fate and the fate of the realm. What is certain is that Vhagar lunged, the massive jaws opened, and the night sky became a tomb. Arrax screamed, a sound that cut through the storm, a high-pitched wail of a dragon, barely older than its rider. Lucerys Velaryon had no time to react. The impact was brief, brutal, and final. Vhagar's teeth closed around the smaller dragon, crushing bone and sinew, and then the flames came. Not a controlled blast, but a gush of fire that consumed the air itself, lighting the clouds orange for a single terrible moment. Arrax fell apart in mid-air, pieces of wing and flesh raining down into the churning sea below. Lucerys was gone before he could even cry out. The storm swallowed the remains, and the waves took what was left. Aemond hovered there for a long moment perhaps, staring at the empty space where his nephew had been. The rain plastered his hair to his face, and Vargar rumbled beneath him, a sound of satisfaction, or perhaps just the deep growl of a predator that had fed. No one could say for certain what Aemond felt in that instant, but he must have understood something. Even then, this was not a battle. This was not a duel between equals. This was murder. Lucerys had been unarmed, on a diplomatic mission, and he was kin. The first blood of the war had been shed, and it was the blood of a child by the hand of his uncle. The title came instantly, silently, burned into the memory of every lord and peasant who would hear the tale. Kinslayer. Vagar turned, perhaps guided by Aemond's hand, perhaps simply weary of the storm. The great dragon climbed through the clouds, leaving the wreckage behind, and began the long flight back to King's Landing. The journey was quiet. No words were spoken. Aemond had no escort, no herald to announce his return. He arrived alone, descending through the grey dawn, Vargar's shadow falling over the red keep like a shroud. The courtyard was nearly empty when he landed. Servants scattered, guards stiffened, and then came the family. Queen Alicent emerged first, her green dress trailing behind her, her face a mask of controlled alarm. She had heard the news before Aemond could speak. Ravens from Storm's End had arrived ahead of him, carrying the grim report to every corner of the realm. The Greens had won a victory, but it was a victory that tasted of ash. Alicent looked at her son, and in her eyes was not pride, but a weary sorrow. She knew what this meant. The war would no longer be a matter of claims and councils. It would be vengeance. Aegon II, still recovering from his wounds at Rook's Rest, was brought to the courtyard in a litter. His face was pale, but he managed a weak smile. He clapped Aemond on the shoulder and called him a true brother, one who had struck a blow for their cause. But the words rang hollow. Even Aegon, reckless and cruel as he could be, understood that killing a messenger was not the same as winning a battle. The small council gathered later, and the mood was tense. Lord Larys Strong whispered that the Blacks would now have every reason to rally the realm against them. Grand Maester Orwyle warned of the consequences, though his voice was barely heard over the arguments, and Aemond sat at the head of the table, wearing the Conqueror's crown as Prince Regent, and said nothing. That night, alone in his chambers, the weight began to settle. He had wanted Lucerys dead for years, ever since that day in the Dragon Pit, when the boy had taken his eye. He had dreamed of it, plotted it, spoken of it in harsh whispers with his brother and mother. But now that it was done, the satisfaction was hollow. There was no triumph, only a cold understanding that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. In the songs, they would call him the Kinslayer, and that name would follow him to his grave and beyond. The realm awoke to the news with horror. In the Red Keep, the Greens whispered behind closed doors. Some praised Aemond's ruthlessness, calling it necessary. Others stared at him with a new wariness, as if he were a dragon that might turn on its own handlers. His sister Helena refused to look at him, her eyes distant, her words even more cryptic than usual. She spoke of a rat and a net and a grisly fate, though no one understood her meaning. Only Aemond seemed to notice, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn winds. He had become something more than a prince. He had become a symbol of the war's darkest nature, and as he stood on the battlements, watching the sun set over the Blackwater, he must have known that this was only the beginning. The death of Lucerys would not end the conflict. It would ignite it, and the flames would consume everything. In the days that followed, the story spread. Lucerys Velaryon had been murdered in the sky above Storm's End, a boy of 14, devoured by Vargar. The Blacks would never forgive. Rhaenyra would never stop mourning, and Daemon, the rogue prince, would sharpen his sword and whisper a promise that would echo across the Riverlands. The battle above the God's Eye was still months away, but Aemond had already set his own path. Every step he took from that moment forward was a step toward that lake, toward the fire, toward the end. But that story must wait for another chapter. For now, we leave Aemond standing in the flickering torchlight of the Red Keep, the Kinslayer's crown heavy on his brow, the weight of a murdered child pressing down on his soul. The war had just begun, and the burden he carried would only grow heavier. When Vhagar's jaws closed around Lucerys Velaryon and the little dragon Arax, the skies above Storm's End did not simply darken with storm clouds. They turned black with the stain of an act that would redefine the war. In that single terrible moment, Aemond Targaryen ceased to be a prince. He became something else entirely, a name that would be whispered with revulsion from the Red Keep to the Godswood of Winterfell, the Kinslayer. It is a title that carries a weight far heavier than any crown. In the eyes of the Seven Kingdoms, to slay a kinsman is to break one of the oldest and most sacred laws. The gods themselves are said to turn their faces from such a deed, and Aemond, though he could argue it was an accident of dragon fury, would never escape that judgment. The moment Vhagar's teeth tore through flesh and bone, the realm understood that this war would have no rules, no mercy, no quarter. But let us consider what Aemond felt in the aftermath. He was not a man who wept easily. He had lost an eye to Lucerys when they were children, and that wound had festered into a cold, relentless hatred. Some say he meant only to frighten the boy, to humble him. Others insist that when he urged Vhagar higher into the storm, he knew exactly what he was doing. Yet the look on his face as he returned to the castle, pale, hollow, silent, told a different story. Even the most hardened warrior can be shaken by the reality of his own cruelty. Aemond had become the monster the Greens had always needed, but monsters do not sleep peacefully. The news of Lucerys' death spread like wildfire. It reached King's Landing before the ravens could carry it, carried on the breath of terrified fishermen who saw the dragon carcass wash ashore, and when it reached Rhaenyra at Dragonstone, the world seemed to stop. She had already lost her father, her stepmother's treachery, and the hope of a peaceful succession. But this was the loss of a child, not just any child. Her second son, the boy who had once taken her side in a childish scuffle, the boy who had been sent to Storm's End as a messenger, trusting in the protection of guest right and the honour of lords. That trust was now ash. Rhaenyra's grief was not quiet. It was a storm of its own. She collapsed, they say, and for 3 days she did not eat. Her husband Daemon held her, but even he could not stem the tide of her sorrow. On the third night, she rose from her bed with eyes that burned like coals. She had become something else too, a mother who had lost a son, and who would now ensure that the Greens felt every inch of that pain. What happened next is perhaps the darkest chapter in the Dance of the Dragons, the retaliation known as Blood and Cheese. 2 men, a former gold cloak named Blood, a ratcatcher named Cheese, were sent into the Red Keep with a single objective: to make Aemond's family feel what Rhaenyra felt. They found not Aemond, but his brother King Aegon's children, the Queen Mother's grandchildren, Helena's twins. Under threat of death, they forced the Queen to choose which of her sons would die. She could not choose. They killed the youngest boy anyway, a child named Jaehaerys, and then fled into the night. It was a horror that no realm could forget, and it was born directly from the death of Lucerys. The cycle of vengeance was now complete. 2 children dead, one on each side, and the war, which might have been settled with treaty or a duel, now had no end except total annihilation. Every lord in the 7 kingdoms understood this. The Greens and Blacks had drawn blood from each other's houses in the most sacred and unforgivable way. There would be no parley, no negotiated peace. The war would be fought until one family was erased entirely. Aemond bore the weight of that knowledge. He had not ordered Blood and Cheese, but he had lit the fuse. He became Prince Regent after his brother Aegon was grievously wounded at Rook's Rest, and he wore the Conqueror's crown as if it were a chain. The realm began to see him not as a protector, but as a scourge. The name Kinslayer stuck to him like tar. Even his own mother looked at him differently. What kind of son kills his own nephew? What kind of prince destroys the future of his house? Yet Aemond did not flinch. He doubled down. He rode Vhagar across the Riverlands, burning castles, defeating armies, crushing any who stood against his brother's claim. But every victory came at a cost. The more he fought, the more he became the symbol of everything wrong with this war. He was no longer the ambitious boy who lost an eye. He was a walking condemnation of Targaryen pride, and he knew it. The death of Lucerys did not just end a life. It ended the possibility of reconciliation. It sealed the fate of both families. From that moment forward, the dance of the dragons would not stop until one side was dead, and Aemond, for all his power, was already moving toward his own end. That end would come above a lake called the God's Eye, in a duel with his uncle Daemon that would shake the very earth. But before that, there was a trap to be sprung at Rook's Rest, a battle that would change the course of the war and leave Aemond holding a crown he never truly wanted. The next chapter is called The Trap at Rook's Rest, and it will test everything he has left. The death of Lucerys Velaryon hung over the realm like a shroud of smoke. Aemond Targaryen had returned to King's Landing, not as a triumphant prince, but as a kinslayer. The word travelled faster than any raven could fly. Lords who had been wavering in their allegiance now hardened their hearts against the Greens, not out of love for Rhaenyra, but out of horror at what Aemond had done. Even within the Red Keep, the silence was deafening. Queen Alicent looked at her second son with eyes that could not quite meet his gaze. King Aegon II, newly crowned, sat on the Iron Throne with a brittle smile that betrayed his unease. For all his bravado, Aegon understood that his brother had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The war had ceased to be a matter of succession. It had become a blood feud. And yet war does not pause for grief. If anything, it accelerates. Rhaenyra's supporters, now inflamed with righteous fury, began to mobilize in earnest. Her stepmother, the fearless Princess Rhaenys, the queen who never was, had already taken to the sky atop her dragon Meleys, the Red Queen. Rhaenys was not a woman to sit idle while her kin were butchered. She was the daughter of a dragon lord, a seasoned warrior who had survived decades of court intrigue, and she burned with a cold, calculating fire. She knew that the Greens would not stop at Lucerys. They would come for all of Rhaenyra's children, and she would meet them in the sky. The Greens understood this too. Aemond, now reviled across the Seven Kingdoms, understood that his only path forward was victory. He could not undo what he had done, but he could ensure that the Blacks paid so dearly that no one would dare call him Kinslayer to his face. He began to formulate a plan, one that required not only his own dragon, Vhagar, but also his brother's dragon, Sunfire, and the full might of the Green Army. The target, Rook's Rest, a castle on the coast of the Crownlands. It was a minor holding, but strategically vital. If the Blacks could take it, they would have a foothold within striking distance of King's Landing. More importantly, they would be forced to commit their dragons to its defence. Aemond knew that Rhaenyra would not send her own sons into such a trap, but she would send Rhaenys. Meleys was the fastest and most experienced dragon in the Black Arsenal, and Rhaenys was the most capable rider. If they could eliminate her, the Blacks would lose their greatest general and their most formidable dragon. The plan was simple in its cruelty. Aegon would ride Sapphire to Rook's Rest first, engaging Meleys in a direct confrontation. Aemond would remain hidden, circling high above the clouds on Vhagar, waiting for the moment to strike. It was a classic pincer attack, but executed on Dragonback. The killing zone would be the air above the castle itself, where the two green dragons would trap Meleys between them. The trap was laid with deliberate precision. The Green Army marched toward Rook's Rest, burning villages and drawing attention. Lord Staunton, the loyalist lord of the castle, sent desperate ravens to Dragonstone, begging for aid. Rhaenyra, still mourning her son, was reluctant to commit her forces, but Rhaenys insisted. She argued that to abandon Rook's Rest would be to hand the Greens the entire Crownlands. And so, with grim determination, Rhaenys mounted Meleys and took flight. She did not know that she was flying into a cage of teeth and fire. The day was grey, the sky thick with clouds that promised rain. Meleys soared low over the coast, her scarlet scales gleaming against the pale sea. Rhaenys saw the smoke rising from Rook's Rest. The towers blackened and the outer walls breached. She saw a lone dragon circling above the castle, sunfire, golden and terrible. She did not see Vargar, but Vargar was there, lurking in the clouds above, a massive form hidden by the mist. Aemond watched his brother begin the engagement. Sunfire diving toward Meleys, with a shriek that tore the air. Meleys turned to meet him, her jaws wide, her flames erupting in a spiraling plume. The two dragons clashed, their bodies twisting in a dance of death, claws raking scales and teeth seeking throats. For a few heartbeats, the battle was even. Meleys was faster, more agile, and Rhaenys was the better rider. She drove Sunfire back, forcing Aegon to retreat toward the castle. But then Aemond made his move. Vhagar descended from the clouds, like a mountain falling. The sound of her wings was a thunder that drowned out all other noise. Rhaenys saw her too late. She had no time to flee, no time to maneuver. Vhagar struck Meleys from above, her weight pressing the Red Queen down toward the ground. Sunfire, emboldened, turned and joined the attack, biting at Meleys' flanks. The collision of three dragons in the sky above Rook's Rest was unlike anything witnessed since the doom of Valyria. It was not a battle of tactics or skill. It was a brutal, primal mauling. Vargar's jaws closed around Meleys' neck, and the Red Queen screamed a sound that echoed for miles. Rhaenys fought to the last, her sword drawn, slashing at Vhagar's eye, but it was hopeless. Meleys crashed into the forest below, her body broken, her rider crushed beneath her. The green dragons, victorious, landed atop the ruin of their enemy, but the victory came at a cost. Aegon had been thrown from Sunfire during the chaos, his body shattered by the fall. He lay broken and barely breathing, his dragon wounded but alive. Aemond stood over the wreckage, his single eye fixed on the corpse of Meleys, then on his brother's mangled form. The trap had worked. The Black Fleet's most powerful weapon was gone, but the price was Aegon's kingship, at least for now. Aemond would rule as Prince Regent, protector of the realm, and the realm would learn to fear his name. Yet even as he surveyed his triumph, he knew that the war was far from over. Rhaenyra would not forgive this, and in the shadows of the Riverlands, another dragon rider was already sharpening his blade, a man whose hatred for Aemond burned hotter than dragonfire. The next chapter would bring fire and fallen queens. The trap at Rook's Rest had been laid with precision, a net of fire and shadow meant to snare the Black Fleet, and any dragon foolish enough to answer the call. Aemond and his brother Aegon had positioned themselves like two pieces on a Syvarse board, their dragons concealed among the rolling hills and mist-shrouded woodlands that surrounded the keep. When the vanguard of the Black forces arrived, the signal was given. The sky erupted. Aemond drove Vargar skyward with a command that came from somewhere deeper than his lungs. The ancient she-dragon answered with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the world. From the opposite side of the valley, Sunfire rose in a blaze of gold, bearing King Aegon II toward the foe. The plan was simple: lure the enemy into a killing ground between two dragons, then close the jaws of the trap. But war has a way of mocking simplicity. The dragon they faced was Meleys, the Red Queen, rider by Rhaenys Targaryen, the queen who never was. She was old, battle-tested, faster perhaps than any other dragon alive, and she did not flee. Instead, Rhaenys turned the ambush into a duel, a clash of titans above the burning fields of Rook's Rest. Meleys met Sunfire head-on, and the two dragons locked together in a storm of claws and flame. Aegon had always been bold, perhaps too bold. He drove Sunfire deep into the fight, seeking glory, seeking to prove himself worthy of the crown. But Meleys was relentless, her jaws tearing into the golden dragon's wing, her talons raking along Sunfire's flank. The king's dragon screamed, a sound that carried across the valley like a shard of glass. And then in a cruel twist, Aemond made his move. He had been waiting, watching, calculating. Vhagar descended from a high cloud bank, her shadow swallowing the battlefield. Below, the death of Rhaenys and the destruction of Meleys came at the hands of Vhagar. In a moment of brutal efficiency, the ancient dragon struck from above, her weight, her age, her sheer indomitability pressing Meleys into the earth. Fire met fire, scales met scales, and the Red Queen fell. Rhaenys Targaryen, the grandmother of the Blacks, the rider who had once been passed over for the throne, perished there, consumed in the inferno she had commanded for so long. But the victory was not clean. In the chaos, King Aegon II had been thrown from his saddle. Sunfire, grievously wounded, crashed into the ground, a broken heap of gold and blood. The king himself suffered severe injuries, his body burned beyond recognition, his bones shattered. He would survive, but only barely, and he would never ride a dragon again. The crown had become a weight he could no longer lift. And Aemond, he emerged from the battle unscathed, his silver eye patch catching the light of the dying fires. Vhagar had not taken a single wound. The prince had not lost a single scale. He circled the battlefield once, twice, surveying the ruin he had helped create, and then he landed. The soldiers of the Green Army knelt as he dismounted, for they understood what the court would soon realise. Aemond Targaryen was now the sole effective dragon rider of the Greens. Sunfire was crippled, Dreamfire still bound to Helena, and the other dragons of their faction were either too young or too far away. Vhagar was the only true weapon left. The shift in the power dynamic was immediate and absolute. With the king incapacitated, lying in a feverish haze under the care of maesters, the realm needed a hand to hold the scepter. The small council, led by Alicent Hightower and Otto Hightower, turned to Aemond. He was named Prince Regent and Protector of the realm. The Conqueror's crown, the circlet of Aegon the Dragon, was placed upon his brow, and for the first time, Aemond One-Eye tasted the full measure of power. Yet that crown, dark and heavy with history, would not rest easy on his head. The war was far from over, and the Blacks would not forget Rook's Rest. But for now, the Greens had a new leader, and his name was whispered with a mixture of fear and respect. The next chapter in this dance of fire would see him don the Iron Crown of the Conqueror, and with it the weight of a throne that demanded everything. The smoke from Rook's Rest still hung over the Blackwater when the news reached King's Landing. King Aegon II, brother monarch, and now a man broken in both body and pride, lay in a bed of pain, his dragon Sunfire so horribly mangled that the great golden beast could barely lift its head. The realm had no sovereign capable of ruling, and so, in the quiet chambers of the Red Keep, surrounded by the smell of burned salves and the weeping of servants, Aemond Targaryen stepped forward. He did not hesitate. He assumed the title of Prince Regent and Protector of the realm, and with those words, the Iron Throne gained a new master, one who had never intended to serve as a mere steward. You might think a regent would be a caretaker, a placeholder, but Aemond had other plans. On the very day of his ascension, he made a choice that sent a clear message to every lord, every maester, every servant in the keep. He went to the royal armoury. He bypassed the simple, weathered circlet his father Viserys had worn, the crown of the old king who had loved peace and compromise. Instead, he lifted the heavy, jagged ring of black steel and rubies that had once belonged to Aegon the Conqueror. He placed it upon his brow, and in that moment, he was no longer the second son, no longer the one-eyed prince in the shadow of a crippled king. He was the embodiment of conquest itself. The crown was not meant for a regent. It was a symbol of absolute dominion, of fire and blood, of the man who had forged the Seven Kingdoms with Dragonflame. When Aemond wore it to the small council, the Lord saw not a caretaker, but a king in all but name, and he governed accordingly. The streets of King's Landing had never known a regent like him. Where his brother had been distracted by wine and pleasure, Aemond was present, watchful and utterly unforgiving. He doubled the patrols of gold cloaks. He executed suspected black sympathizers without trial. He emptied the treasury, to pay for mercenaries and new siege equipment, and he refused every embassy, every letter, every plea for parley. When his mother, Alicent, still grieving for her injured son, begged him to consider a truce, he dismissed her with a coldness that froze the very air around them. He had no interest in compromise. He wanted total military victory, and he would burn every village, every castle, every family that stood between him and that goal. But there was a method beneath the cruelty. Aemond understood something that many regents never grasp. Fear is a faster currency than loyalty. He made examples. He hung deserters from the city walls. He sent the heads of captured Black Knights to Rhaenyra's allies, each skull branded with the mark of the Conqueror's crown. And he rode Vargar every evening, a black silhouette against the sunset, reminding the whole capital that the largest dragon in the world answered only to him. Yet even as he consolidated power, the cost began to show. The small council chambers grew quieter. Lords spoke in whispers. Aemond's own advisors began to fear that the Prince Regent was becoming something more dangerous than a king, a tyrant with no off switch. But he did not care. He saw himself as the instrument of prophecy, the heir to Aegon the Dragon, the one who would end the war on his own terms. He would not negotiate with those he considered bastards and traitors. He would not share the throne. He would crush them. And so the regency began, not as a pause in the conflict, but as its most savage chapter. The iron crown of the Conqueror sat heavy on Aemond's brow, and under its weight, the realm braced for fire. What happened next? The shaping of his rule, the campaigns he launched, and the terrible price he was willing to pay is the story we will continue in the next chapter, The Protector's Rule. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. When Aemond Targaryen placed the Iron Crown of Aegon the Conqueror upon his brow, he was not merely affirming his authority as Prince Regent. He was declaring something far more dangerous, that he intended to rule with a severity that mirrored the first king himself. The crown was heavy, a relic from the age of conquest, and its weight seemed to press down on everything Aemond touched. He no longer saw himself as a substitute for his wounded brother, Aegon II. In his own mind, he was the true ruler now, and the realm would know it. The first task of the Protector was to purge the Crown lands of every trace of black loyalty. These were the lands that surrounded King's Landing, the fields and castles that supplied the capital with grain, timber, and men. Many lords had declared for Rhaenyra in the opening months of the war, and Aemond did not forgive. He rode Vargar across the hills and river valleys, a shadow, a terror that preceded him. In town after town he demanded oaths of fealty, and those who hesitated saw their keeps burned. At Duskendale, he ordered the execution of 40 knights who had once served Rhaenyra's household. At Rosby, he forced the elderly lord to watch his son be taken as a hostage for the crown. The aggressiveness of these campaigns was deliberate. Aemond wanted no safe haven for black partisans within a day's ride of the Red Keep, but every purge came at a cost. The fields were left untended, the roads filled with refugees, and the capital's food stores shrank with each passing week. The logistical challenges of holding King's Landing, while Rhaenyra's forces closed in from 3 directions, strained the Green Council to its breaking point. The city gates had to be manned day and night. The gold cloaks were stretched thin, and desertion became a quiet plague. Ships in the Blackwater Bay stopped arriving from loyal ports, their captains too afraid of black raiders. The treasury, already drained by the war, could barely pay the guards their wages. Aemond ordered a special levy on the wealthiest merchants, but that only bred resentment in the streets. Whispers of rebellion began to circulate among the small folk. They remembered Rhaenyra's father, King Viserys, as a gentle ruler, and they wondered why they had to starve under his son's regent. Aemond's reply was to strengthen the patrols and double the number of informants in every district. He would not lose the capital through famine or unrest. In the midst of these burdens, Aemond came to rely more and more on Criston Cole as his hand and chief military advisor. Cole had been the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard under Viserys, then hand for Aegon II. Now he became Aemond's right hand in all matters of war. Cole was a man of iron discipline, a veteran of countless battles, and he understood the brutal arithmetic of holding power. He advised Aemond to consolidate forces rather than scatter them, to hold the strongholds along the Rosby Road and starve out the black armies in the field. Aemond listened, but he did not always follow. Where Cole counselled patience, Aemond wanted action. The prince's impulsive nature chafed against the careful planning of his hand, and yet, without Cole's steady presence, the regency would have collapsed within weeks. This friction within the Green Council grew sharper as Aemond's decisions became more reckless. Lord Aemond Hightower, the Master of Laws, warned that the spilling of too much blood in the Crownlands would alienate the great houses who still remained neutral. Grand Maester Orwyle pleaded for a more lenient policy toward captured Black Lords, arguing that mercy could turn enemies into allies, but Aemond dismissed them. He saw their caution as weakness, the same weakness that had allowed Rhaenyra to gather her armies in the first place. He wore the Conqueror's crown, he reminded them, and the Conqueror had never begged for loyalty. He took it. The council chamber grew silent after those words, but the unease lingered. Men began to wonder if Aemond's ambition was driving them toward a catastrophe they could not control. The Protector's rule, then, was a storm of fire and iron, but a storm that fed on itself. Each purge made the land poorer. Each execution made the enemy more bitter. Each day of hunger made the city more volatile. And through it all, Aemond sat in the throne room, the iron crown on his head, staring south and west toward the black host that was gathering. He knew that Rhaenyra's armies were not the only threat. There was one dragon rider in particular who would come for him, a prince who had once been his uncle, a warrior without equal, a man who had already killed one king and would not hesitate to kill another. The war was not yet decided, and as the autumn winds began to blow across the Riverlands, the greatest gamble of Aemond's life was about to begin. That would be the hunt for the rogue prince. After the relentless campaigns through the Crownlands, after the fires and the shattered keeps, and the steady erasure of black loyalists from the map, Aemond Targaryen found himself facing a truth he could no longer ignore. For all his victories, for all the blood he had spilled from Varga's shadow, the heart of the war had not yet been struck. Rhaenyra still ruled from Dragonstone, her armies still gathered, and above all, Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince himself, was still alive, still riding caraxes, still weaving his webs across the Riverlands. And that was the thought that burned brightest in Aemond's mind. He had become Prince Regent, protector of the realm, wearing the Conqueror's crown, seated on the Iron Throne in his brother's absence. But the throne felt hollow when the man who had once mocked him as a child, who had laughed at his missing eye, who had whispered of bastards and bloodlines, remained free. Daemon was not merely a general in the enemy army. He was the embodiment of everything Aemond hated. The arrogance of the Blacks, the mockery of his injury, the living proof that the Green's claim was never truly secure. And so, as the autumn of 130 grew cold, and the rivers of the Riverlands began to swell with rain, Aemond made a choice. He would hunt Daemon Targaryen. He would find him, corner him, and end him. And he would do it himself on Vargar, with fire and fury. On paper, it seemed like a sound strategy. If the Blacks lost Daemon, they lost their most brilliant warrior, their most experienced dragon rider, the man who held the loyalty of the Riverlords and the Northmen. But the problem was not the goal. The problem was the means. To pursue Daemon, Aemond had to leave King's Landing. And to leave King's Landing, he had to strip the capital of its most fearsome defender. Vhagar could not be everywhere at once. The city would be guarded by the remaining green forces, by the gold cloaks, by the walls and the gates and the faith that no enemy would dare strike, while the largest dragon in the world was still in the realm. But Aemond knew that Daemon would not fight a straightforward battle. The rogue prince was a master of misdirection, of feints and false retreats, of drawing his enemies into traps. And so, even as Aemond mounted Vargar and flew east toward the Riverlands, he was already playing into Daemon's hands. The hunt began in earnest. Aemond swept across the countryside, from Harrenhal to the Twins, from the Green Fork to the Red Fork, burning villages that harboured black sympathisers, interrogating lords who might know Daemon's whereabouts. But every trail led to a dead end. A sighting here, a rumour, they're always just out of reach. Daemon seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. He would appear at a council of riverlords, then vanish before Aemond could arrive. He would raid a green supply convoy, then melt into the marshes, and all the while, Aemond's frustration grew. He had the most powerful weapon in the world, and he could not use it because he could not find his target. He began to neglect his duties as protector. Letters from the small council went unanswered. Reports of unrest in the Crown Lands were ignored. His entire world narrowed to a single burning obsession. Aemond Targaryen must die, and while he chased shadows in the Riverlands, the capital of the Seven Kingdoms was left vulnerable. Rhaenyra had not been idle. From Dragonstone, she had been gathering her strength, biding her time, waiting for the moment when the Greens would make a mistake. And that moment had arrived. With Aemond away on Vargar, with Aegon sick and still recovering from his injuries at Rook's Rest, with the city's defences reduced to token forces, the Blacks saw their chance. Rhaenyra's fleet, supported by the dragon Caraxes, though Caraxes was with Daemon in the Riverlands, and the smaller dragons of her sons, sailed across Blackwater Bay. The hour of the wolf came silently, under cover of darkness, and by dawn the gates of King's Landing were thrown open by sympathetic lords within. The gold cloaks, many of whom had once served Daemon, offered little resistance. The Red Keep's halls, once the bastion of green power, were now filled with the banners of Rhaenyra Targaryen. Aemond learned of the fall of the capital not from a raven, but from a terrified messenger who found him at a burned-out inn near the God's Eye. The messenger's face was pale, his words stumbling. The city had fallen. Queen Alicent had been taken. King Aegon, still weak, had fled, and Rhaenyra now sat on the Iron Throne, wearing the crown that Aemond had worn only days before. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been outmaneuvered, not by a knight, not by a general, but by Aemond Targaryen. The rogue prince had not been hiding at all. He had been baiting. Every sighting, every false trail, every skirmish in the Riverlands had been designed to draw Aemond away from home, and Aemond, blind with rage and pride, had fallen for it completely. For a long moment he stood in silence, the wind from Vagar's wings stirring the dust around him. His one eye, the one that remained, burned with fury and humiliation. He had traded a city for a phantom. He had abandoned the realm for a grudge, and now the realm was lost. But even in that moment of crushing defeat, Aemond did not waver. He would not return to King's Landing to beg for terms. He would not admit defeat. He would continue the hunt, because if he could not hold the throne, he could at least take the life of the man who had stolen it. And so, as the rains of the Riverlands began to fall harder, as the autumn turned to the first whispers of winter, Aemond Targaryen tightened his grip on Vagar's reins and turned his gaze eastward toward the God's Eye, where he knew, somehow he knew, Daemon was waiting. What followed would become the most infamous dragon duel in the history of Westeros. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, let us leave Aemond in that haunted landscape, riding a beast of legend, his mind fixed on vengeance, his heart black with the knowledge that he had been undone by the very cunning he had sought to destroy. The Riverlands would soon know him as their scourge, and the fire that would consume them both was only just beginning to kindle. Aemond Targaryen had left King's Landing almost on a whim, the city he was sworn to protect, as Prince Regent now sat under a skeleton garrison, its true defences nothing but the memory of Vagar's shadow. He was done waiting for Aemond Targaryen to come to him. If the rogue prince wanted to hide in the rivers and ruins, Then Aemond would burn every reed and stone until he flushed him out. The Riverlands had always been a stubborn land, its lords proud, its people loyal to Rhaenyra's cause. But loyalty is a fragile thing when it is tested by fire from above. The campaign began with the strongholds. One by one, the castles and keeps that had declared for the Blacks saw Varga's silhouette on the horizon. At first, the lords believed they could hold behind stone walls. They had seen dragons before. They had heard of Harrenhal's melted towers from centuries past. But knowing history is not the same as living through it. Aemond did not offer terms. He did not send ravens demanding surrender. He simply came and he burned. Stonework crumbled under the heat. Wooden keeps became infernos in minutes. The dragon's breath turned moats to steam and turned men to ash before they could even scream. Aemond flew low, watching the chaos unfold below with something like satisfaction. He was not merely destroying military targets. He was sending a message to the Riverlords, to the Blacks, and most of all to Daemon. Every settlement that went up in smoke was an invitation. Come out and face me, uncle. Stop hiding behind the skirts of your supporters. The psychological warfare was deliberate. Aemond knew that Daemon, for all his bravado, was a creature of impulse. If enough innocent blood was spilled, the rogue prince would be forced to act. And so the Prince Regent turned his attention to the villages, the farms, the market towns that had no walls and no soldiers. They were simply there, in the path of his war. Vhagar's fire did not discriminate between a garrison and a granary. The fields burned for days. The rivers ran black with soot. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing south toward the Reach, or east toward the Crownlands. But there was nowhere to go that Aemond could not reach. The mounting civilian casualties were staggering. Chroniclers of the time wrote that the smoke from the Riverlands could be seen from the towers of Harrenhal, itself a haunted ruin, but now a staging ground for the greatest destruction the realm had seen since Aegon's conquest. Whole bloodlines were extinguished in a single pass. The names of the dead were too many to record. The small folk who had no stake in the dance became its primary victims, and Aemond did not care. In his mind, they were not innocents. They were the soil in which Rhaenyra's rebellion had taken root. To starve the weed, you burn the field. He made Harrenhal his base of operations. The cursed castle, with its twisted stone and its silent halls, became the throne from which he ruled the Riverlands with an iron fist. But even there, he was not alone. A woman began to appear in the shadows of the great hall. A healer, as some said, a witch, others whispered. Her name was Alice Rivers. She could see things that others could not. She told him where Daemon might be, where the next pocket of resistance lay, and she gave him comfort in the cold nights. He began to trust her as much as he could trust anyone, and she was there when the first reports came of a great dragon moving through the lakes and forests to the north. Caraxes, the Red Death, was on the move. Daemon had finally taken the bait, but before that final clash, the Riverlands continued to burn. Aemond's scorched earth policy had become legendary in its brutality. It was not strategy anymore. It was obsession, consumption, the slow unravelling of a mind that had been sharpened by loss and hardened by power. He wore the Conqueror's crown as he rode Vhagar from one smoking ruin to the next, and the people learned to fear the sound of wings before they ever saw the fire. One night, as the flames reflected in his remaining eye, Aemond received a message from the witch of that cursed castle. She spoke of a vision, a lake, a shadow, and a duel that would end all duels. It was the only thing that finally made him turn his dragon toward the God's Eye. And in that moment, the Riverlands could finally begin to breathe again. But the witch's vision was far from finished with him. The black smoke from a dozen burning Riverland settlements still clung to Vhagar's hide when Aemond Targaryen first laid his single eye upon the towers of Harrenhal. It was the autumn of 129 after the conquest, and the great dragon shadow slipped across the cursed castle like a knife drawn across skin. Aemond had come to the largest fortress in all of Westeros, not as a liberator or a defender, but as an occupier. The Scorched Earth campaign through the Riverlands had served its purpose. It had taught the black-aligned lords what it meant to defy the Iron Throne. But it had also left him weary in a way that fire alone could not cure. He needed a base. He needed a position from which to hunt his greatest prey. And Harrenhal, for all its dark reputation, was the perfect lair for a dragon prince who had begun to see himself as something more than a man. The castle loomed before him like a monument to failure. It had been built by Harren the Black, a king so arrogant he believed his walls could withstand any dragon. Aegon the Conqueror had proven him wrong, melting the stone with Balerion's fire until the towers sagged and the stones wept. 3 centuries later, the scars still showed. The great hall was roofless. The towers leaned at angles that defied reason, and the people of the Riverlands whispered that the castle was haunted. Not by ghosts in the common sense, but by something older, something that fed on the misery of everyone who crossed its threshold. Aemond did not believe in ghosts. He believed in dragons, in blood, in the right of conquest. But as Hagar descended through the mist that clung to Harrenhal like a burial shroud, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The castle's garrison had already fled. The Stark forces that had held it for the Blacks had abandoned their posts the moment word arrived that Vargar was coming. Aemond found the gates thrown open, the halls empty, the fires in the great hearths reduced to cold ash. It was as though the castle had been waiting for him. He walked the corridors alone that first night, his boots echoing against stone that had known the footsteps of 100 doomed lords. Every lord who had ever held Harrenhal had met a violent end, and the castle remembered them all. The Targaryen prince told himself he was different. He was a dragon rider. He was the protector of the realm. He wore the crown of Aegon, the Conqueror itself. But even as he thought these things, he noticed that the shadows in Harrenhal seemed deeper than they should have been. Sounded almost like whispered names. It was on the 3rd night of his occupation that he met her. He had been reviewing maps in the chamber that had once belonged to Lord Strong. A room that still smelled faintly of old blood and older secrets. When he heard a sound that did not belong, it was not the creak of settling stone or the distant cry of a nightbird. It was a voice, low and clear, singing a song in a language he did not recognize. Aemond rose from his chair and followed the sound through a maze of crumbling corridors until he came to a small courtyard that had been overgrown with weeds and wild roses. There, kneeling beside a shallow well, was a woman. She looked up at him as though she had known he was coming. Her hair was dark and fell past her shoulders in waves that caught the moonlight. Her eyes were the colour of deep water, and they held a stillness that Aemond found unsettling. She wore a simple grey dress, and her hands were stained with soil and something darker. She was not beautiful in the way of the highborn ladies he had known at court. She was something else entirely. She was Alice Rivers, and she had been waiting for him long before he ever set foot in the Riverlands. Alice was no stranger to Harrenhal. She had been born in its shadow, or perhaps within its walls. No one could say for certain. She was the bastard daughter of former Castellan, or perhaps the child of a serving woman, and something that was not entirely human. The rumours followed her like a cloak. Some said she was a healer, skilled in the old arts that the maesters had long dismissed as superstition. Others said she was a witch, that she could see things that had not yet happened and speak to those who had long since passed. And still others whispered that she was something darker, that she drew power from the castle itself, from the centuries of death and suffering that had soaked into its foundations. Aemond had heard these rumours before he arrived, but he had dismissed them as the fancies of frightened small folk. Now looking into her eyes, he was not so certain. She spoke to him that night in the courtyard, and her voice carried a weight that made him listen. She told him that he carried a shadow with him, a shadow that had been with him since the day he lost his eye. She told him that the dragon inside him was not Vargar, but something older, something that had been sleeping in his blood since the day he was born. And she told him that he would not find what he was looking for in the Riverlands. Not yet, but soon. Aemond should have had her executed. He should have dismissed her as a charlatan or a spy for the Blacks. Instead, he found himself returning to that courtyard, night after night, drawn by a pull he could not explain. She was unlike anyone he had ever known. She did not flinch at his scars. She did not bow to his title. She looked at him as though she could see through his skin and into the fire that burned beneath. And in a world that had taught him to trust no one, that was intoxicating. Their relationship deepened in the weeks that followed. Aemond took her into his confidence, sharing strategies and fears that he had never voiced aloud. She listened without judgment, and when she spoke, her words carried a certainty that he had not felt since the days before his brother's coronation. She began to offer him guidance, sometimes directly, sometimes in riddles that only made sense after the events they foretold had come to pass. She warned him of an ambush near the crossing of the Trident, and he avoided it. She told him that a black-aligned lord would attempt to defect, but that the man's loyalty was false, and he was proven right when the lord was found dead the next morning. She described the death of a raven that carried a message from King's Landing, and the raven did not arrive. Each prophecy, each vision, each whispered truth bound him more tightly to her. The garrison began to notice. Soldiers who had once joked about the Witch of Harrenhal grew silent when she passed. They saw the way their prince looked at her, the way he sought her counsel before every major decision. They whispered that she had cast a spell on him, that she had stolen his will with her dark arts. But those who watched closely knew the truth was more complicated. Aemond had not lost his will. He had found something he had never had before. Someone who saw him not as a prince or a kinslayer or a monster, but as a man carrying a burden too heavy for any one person to bear. And she helped him carry it, even as the war pressed in from all sides. The visions became a regular part of Aemond's military planning. He would bring maps to her chamber, spread them across the floor, and ask her where the next threat would come from. She would close her eyes and describe what she saw. Flames in the east, a shadow moving through the mountains, a crown that was not a crown. Some of her visions were clear, others murky, but Aemond learned to trust them. He diverted troops based on her words. He delayed attacks because of a feeling she could not explain. He became, in the eyes of his enemies, unpredictable. But in his own mind, he had never been more certain. And then the rumours began. They started among the servants, spread to the soldiers, and eventually reached the ears of the lords, who had allied with the Greens. The whispers said that Aemond had taken Alice to his bed, that the Witch of Harrenhal was now the prince's paramour. Some claimed they had seen them walking the battlements at night, his hand resting on her back, her head tilted toward his as they spoke in low voices. Others claimed they had heard sounds from his chambers that were not the sounds of strategy. And then came the darkest rumour of all, the one that no one dared speak aloud in the presence of the prince. Alice Rivers was with child. The heir to the throne, or perhaps to something darker, was growing in her womb within the cursed walls of Harrenhal. Aemond never confirmed the rumours, but he never denied them either. He kept Alice close, closer than any advisor or general. She slept in a chamber adjacent to his own, and guards were posted at her door at all times. The prince who had once burned villages without a second thought now became protective, almost possessive, of the woman who had shown him visions of the future. He consulted her before every battle, every march, every decision that could shift the course of the war. His enemies began to notice a pattern. Aemond was no longer acting solely on instinct or ambition. He was acting on prophecy. The influence of Alice Rivers on Aemond Targaryen cannot be overstated. She did not create his ruthlessness or his hunger for vengeance. Those were already there, forged in the fire of the eye pit and cemented by the death of Lucerys. But she gave those instincts direction. She shaped them, owned them, aimed them at targets that her visions revealed. Some historians have argued that she was manipulating him, using her powers to steer the war in a direction that served her own mysterious purposes. Others have suggested that she genuinely cared for him, that their bond was real, and that her visions were her way of trying to save him from the fate she could see. Approaching like a storm on the horizon, the truth is impossible to know. But what is certain is that the weeks Aemond spent at Harrenhal with Alys Rivers changed him in ways that no battle ever could. The cold prince, who had arrived with smoke in his wake, began to show cracks in his armour. He spoke to her of his childhood, of the night he lost his eye, of the hatred that had been burning in his chest for nearly a decade, and she listened, and she held his hand, and she told him that the fire inside him did not have to consume everything it touched. Whether he believed her is another question. By the time winter settled over the Riverlands, Aemond had become a fixture at Harrenhal. He had not found Daemon, not yet. The rogue prince remained elusive, a ghost moving through the forests and hills of the Riverlands, always one step ahead. But Aemond was no longer obsessed with the hunt in the same way. He still wanted to kill his uncle. That hunger had not faded, but it had been joined by something else. A patience, a stillness, a willingness to wait for the right moment, rather than charging into every fire with Vargar's flames. And as the snow began to fall on the twisted towers of Harrenhal, Aemond sat in his chamber with Alys beside him, her hand resting on her stomach, her eyes fixed on the flames in the hearth. She was seeing something in the fire, something he could not see. And when he asked her what it was, she turned to him with a look that was equal parts sorrow and certainty. She said only one word, his name. And in that word, Aemond heard everything she could not bring herself to say. The visions in the flames were only beginning, and what they would show him in the days to come would change everything he thought he knew about the war, about his enemies, and about himself. The Witch of Harrenhal, Alys Rivers, was more than just a healer or a woman of mysterious origins. She was a seer, and her visions were not gentle whispers of distant possibility. They came to her in the flames that flickered, in the hearths of that cursed castle, in the smoke that rose from the torch sconces, and in the eyes of the men who sought her counsel. And in the weeks that followed Aemond Targaryen's occupation of Harrenhal, Alys began to show him what she saw. Her prophecies were not kind. She told Aemond that the war would not end in triumph for the Greens. The crown would not rest easily on Aegon's brow, and the realm would bleed for generations. She spoke of a doom that awaited him, a battle that would be his last, and a fire that would consume him utterly. Aemond listened, and for the first time in his life, he did not mock or dismiss the words of a sorceress. Perhaps the weight of his own actions had finally begun to press down upon him. Perhaps the curse of Harrenhal, that ancient stone tomb of ambition and madness, was already seeping into his soul. The isolation of the Prince Regent became absolute. News reached Harrenhal, carried by ravens and weary messengers, of defeats across the realm. The Riverlands, which he had scorched with Vargar's fire, still rallied against him. The lords who had once sworn for the Greens were falling. Lord Larys Strong, the man who had helped orchestrate the coup, had vanished. Criston Cole, the hand of the king, had been slain in a desperate battle. Even his own sister, Helaena, had suffered a fate that neither Aemond nor anyone else could speak of without a shudder. The green cause was crumbling like a tower of ash, and Aemond knew that he was its last pillar. He did not retreat. He did not seek to consolidate what remained of his brother's forces. Instead, he turned inward. Aemond's descent into a fatalistic mindset was gradual at first, then sudden and complete. He spent long hours in the chambers of Alys Rivers, listening to her prophecies, watching the flames dance and twist into shapes only she could interpret. He would ask her about Daemon Targaryen, about Rhaenyra, about the end, and she would answer, always with the same refrain, that the end would come for him, that it would be bloody, and that he would meet his match in a battle above a great lake. The Prince Regent, once so full of fire and ambition, became a man hollowed by certainty. He no longer cared about the war's outcome in the way a lord or a general might. He cared only about one thing, his uncle Aemond Targaryen. The rogue prince had eluded him for months, hiding in the Riverlands, earning villages, drawing Aemond deeper and deeper into a trap of his own making. And Aemond, knowing now that his fate was sealed, decided to meet it head-on. It was in the great hall of Harrenhal, beneath the blackened stones that had witnessed so much death, that Aemond wrote the message that would seal his doom. He called for a rider, gave him a scroll sealed with the green wax of the royal house, and commanded that it be delivered into the hands of Aemond Targaryen himself. The words were simple. Aemond challenged his uncle to a duel to the death, to be fought above the God's Eye, a lake in the heart of the Riverlands. He offered no terms, no conditions, no opportunity for surrender, only fire and blood. When Alas Rivers heard of the challenge, she did not try to dissuade him. She only looked at him with those deep knowing eyes and said, "You will both die." Aemond did not flinch. He had already accepted that truth. The green cause was lost. His brother was broken. The realm hated him. All that remained was the chance to take Aemond Targaryen with him into the abyss. He climbed Vargar one final time from the cursed grounds of Harrenhal, the great she-dragon's wings casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the sunset, and he flew toward the God's Eye, toward the last fire that would ever warm him. What awaited him there was not merely a duel. It was the culmination of every choice he had ever made, every drop of blood he had spilled, every prophecy he had heard in the flames. And the moment he saw Caraxes rising from the mist, the red dragon's serpentine neck coiling like a striking snake, Aemond knew that Alice had been right. This was the end, but he did not turn away. He did not hesitate. He urged Vargar forward, and the two great beasts closed the distance between them, their roars shaking the very waters below. The chapter that follows, Confrontation Above the God's Eye, is one of the most harrowing passages in the history of House Targaryen. But before we reach that final fiery embrace, we must understand what Aemond carried with him into the sky. He carried the loss of his eye, the ghost of Lucerys, the weight of a crown he never wanted, and the cold comfort of a witch's prophecy. He carried nothing else, for he had already given everything else to the war. And in the next chapter, we will witness how that war finally claimed him. The prophecies of Alice Rivers had taken root in Aemond's mind like black ivy in a crumbling tower. He had heard her speak of doom and glory, of a fate from which there was no escape. And though he refused to show fear, the words lingered. He was the Prince Regent, the protector of the realm, the rider of Vargar, the largest dragon still alive. And yet, in the cursed ruins of Harrenhal, surrounded by the whispers of the damned, he began to feel the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. The green cause was crumbling. King's Landing was lost. His brother Aegon lay wounded and broken. And now, the one man in all of Westeros who matched his ruthlessness, his ambition, his sheer will to destroy, was coming for him. Aemond Targaryen arrived at the gates of Harrenhal, not with a host of banners or a great army, but on the back of Caraxes, the Red Death, his own terrible dragon. He came alone, or nearly so, a bold challenge that spoke to his nature. He did not storm the castle walls. He waited. For 13 days, Daemon remained outside the ancient fortress, a ghost in the mist, a silent taunt that grated on Aemond's pride. The Prince Regent knew exactly why his uncle had come. This was no siege, it was a summons, a duel to end all duels. Above the lake called the God's Eye, where the waters were said to be bottomless, and the trees of the weirwood forest watched with carved red eyes. The two most dangerous men in Westeros had finally come face to face, not as allies, not as enemies in a war of politics, but as predators circling the same kill. On the morning of the 13th day, Aemond emerged from Harrenhal's twisted stone corridors. He wore his silver eye patch, his hair tied back, his black armor glinting in the pale light. Behind him, the shadows of the castle seemed to stretch and twist, as if the very stones knew what was about to happen. He walked across the muddy ground toward the camp. Daemon had set up near the shore of the lake. There was no fanfare, no retinue of knights, only two Targaryen princes, each with a dragon's fire in their blood, meeting for the last time on solid earth. Daemon stood by a dying campfire, his hand resting casually on Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel sword that had already tasted the blood of kings. He was older than Aemond, but there was an ageless quality to him, a coiled tension that promised violence. He did not smile. He did not offer pleasantries. Instead, he simply looked at Aemond with those grey eyes that held all the weariness and cruelty of a lifetime of war. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the calls of distant birds and the faint lap of water against the shore. Aemond spoke first, his voice cold and measured. He said, "You have come a long way to die, uncle." And Daemon replied just as softly, "I have come to end this, one way or another." Those were the only words exchanged before they mounted their dragons for the last time. No grand speeches, no offers of surrender. They knew what this moment demanded. The fate of the realm, the war, the centuries of Targaryen blood and fire, all of it would be decided in the sky above the God's Eye. As they climbed into their saddles, Aemond glanced one last time at the cursed castle that had been his refuge and his prison. He thought of Alice Rivers and her prophecies, of the flames that had shown him a future he could not escape. He did not look back again. The sun was beginning to set over the lake, painting the water in shades of amber and crimson. The sky turned to fire, and the clouds scattered as if fleeing from what was to come. Vhagar rose first, her massive wings stirring the air like a hurricane, a roar splitting the silence of the evening. Caraxes followed, his serpentine body twisting upward, his shriek a high piercing cry that seemed to come from another world. The two dragons circled higher and higher, each beat of their wings pulling them into a deadly spiral. The battle above the God's Eye had begun, and the world below held its breath. This was not a battle for territory or honor. This was a battle of annihilation, a collision of hate and destiny that would leave only fire and ash in its wake. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the last light of day caught the scales of Vhagar and Caraxes, turning them into molten gold and blood red. The two riders leaned into their saddles, and the dance of death began. The sunlight had finally broken through the dense clouds above the God's Eye, casting a pale silver glow across the restless water. For 13 days, Daemon Targaryen had waited at Harrenhal, his presence a silent challenge that Aemond could not ignore. And now, on the 14th morning, the great shadow of Vhagar passed over the castle, blotting out the sun for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Aemond was coming. The two dragons met high above the lake, their silhouettes carved against a sky that had turned the colour of old steel. Below them, the God's Eye shimmered like a vast, dark mirror, reflecting the distant clouds and the faint outline of the approaching storm. It was a stage set for something ancient and terrible, a dance that would be remembered long after the last flame died. From the moment they began their circling, the contrast between Vhagar and Caraxes was unmistakable. Vhagar moved through the air with the slow, crushing force of a continental glacier. Her wings were vast, tattered at the edges from centuries of battle, each beat sending a tremor through the atmosphere that could be felt on the ground. She was a living mountain, a creature of pure mass and inertia. Every turn she made required a long arcing curve, and when she opened her mouth, the fire that poured forth was a river of destruction, wide and deep, and nearly impossible to escape. Caraxes, in contrast, was a whip of red scales and sinuous muscle. He twisted and turned with a lethal agility that seemed almost impossible for a creature his size. His neck was long, his body slender, and he could coil in midair like a serpent striking at a bird. Where Vhagar was a hammer, Caraxes was a blade. Where Vhagar crushed, Caraxes sliced. And in the hands of Daemon Targaryen, the Red Death became an instrument of surgical fury. They began their dance high above the shimmering water, several thousand feet up, circling each other in a widening gyre. Aemond, mounted on Vhagar's neck, was a speck of silver and black against the monster's bulk. Daemon, smaller yet unmistakable, rode Caraxes low, his body pressed flat against the dragon's spine. Neither man called out. there was no need for words. This was a battle that had been written in the stars since the day Aemond lost his eye. And every act of violence had been a step toward this moment. Vhagar struck first. She lunged forward with a burst of speed that seemed to defy her size, her jaws gaping wide. But Caraxes was already moving, coiling to the side and slashing upward with his claws. The two beasts collided with a sound that was more like thunder than flesh, a deep, resonant boom that rolled across the lake and shattered the silence of the Riverlands for miles in every direction. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a grappling match between titans, fought in 3 dimensions. Vhagar tried to bite down on Caraxes' neck, but the smaller dragon twisted, raking his talons across Vhagar's eye ridges. Blood sprayed across the sky, dark and steaming. Vhagar roared, and the sound carried for leagues. In villages along the shore, men and women looked up from their work, shielding their eyes against the sun, and saw 2 specks wrestling in the heavens, surrounded by bursts of dragonfire that lit the clouds from within. The aerial maneuvers were breathtaking, even for those who could only guess at what they were witnessing. Caraxes would dive at Vhagar's belly, only to pull up at the last instant, releasing a torrent of flame that washed over Vhagar's wings. Vhagar would retaliate with a sweep of her tail, a blow that could have shattered stone, but Caraxes would slither away, always a hair's breadth ahead of destruction. It was a dance of death, choreographed by centuries of instinct and years of hatred. And then, the moment came when the 2 dragons locked together in a terminal descent. It happened so fast that even the most seasoned observers could not say who initiated it. Vhagar had caught Caraxes in a headlong charge, and instead of dodging, Daemon chose to meet her head-on. The 2 dragons collided chest to chest, their claws sinking into each other's flesh. Caraxes' long neck whipped around, his jaws clamping onto Vhagar's throat. Vhagar, in turn, closed her massive teeth around Caraxes' wing, biting down until the bone cracked. Together, they began to fall. The sound was unlike anything that had ever been heard in that part of the world. The roar of dragonfire, the tearing of scales and wings, the screams of 2 men who would not let go, all of it mixed into a single, horrifying chord that echoed across the water and into the hills. It was the sound of an empire dying, of a family tearing itself apart with teeth and fire, farmers in their fields, shepherds on the hillsides, mothers in their cottages. Everyone who heard it knew, deep in their bones, that something irrevocable had just occurred. They fell for what felt like an eternity, spinning and thrashing, locked in a death grip that neither could escape. The wind rushed past them, carrying the stench of blood and burnt flesh. Vhagar's great wings beat uselessly, trying to slow the descent, but Caraxes' weight and the angle of the fall made it impossible. The lake below grew larger, the shimmering surface turning from a mirror into a moor. When they hit, the water exploded upward in a plume that dwarfed any wave the god's eye had ever seen. There was no fire, only the deep, wet crash of bodies colliding with liquid force. The dragons disappeared beneath the surface, dragging their riders with them. For a long moment there was silence. The ripples spread outward in concentric circles, and then the water began to settle, as if it had never been disturbed. No one saw them emerge. No one saw Aemond or Daemon again. The 2 most dangerous men in Westeros had taken each other into the depths, and the god's eye had claimed them both. But in that final instant, before the darkness took him, Aemond may have felt a strange, fleeting peace. The war was over for him. The dance was done. And yet, even as the water closed over Vhagar's massive skull, something else was happening beneath the surface. A blade, dark and slender, had found its way through the chaos. That story of Dark Sister's final strike is the one we must turn to next. The 2 dragons had been circling each other for what felt like an eternity, their roars echoing across the gods. Eye like thunder from a storm that would never break. Vhagar, ancient and vast, her scales the colour of rusted bronze, moved with the slow inevitability of a continent shifting. Caraxes, lean and supine, coiled and struck with the speed of a striking viper, his red hide gleaming wetly in the fading light. Above the shimmering lake, they danced. A dance that had begun with Daemon's challenge at Harrenhal, a challenge that had hung in the air for 13 days, while Aemond refused to meet him. But now, there was no more waiting. The battle had been a brutal exchange of fire and fang. Vhagar's jaws had snapped close to Carax's neck more than once. But the Red Death was too quick, too wily. He would twist away at the last instant, leaving Vhagar to bite only air. Aemond, riding high on the monster's back, pressed his attack with relentless fury. He had the advantage of raw power. Vhagar could simply outlast any opponent, crush them through sheer mass. But Aemond Targaryen was not a man who fought by the rules of weight and measure. He was a creature of improvisation, of desperate gambles, and he knew that if this duel continued much longer, Caraxes would tire and Vhagar would devour them both. It was then that Daemon made his move. As the two dragons collided again, their bodies twisting in a spiral of scales and flame, Daemon did the unthinkable. He unbuckled his saddle. He rose from his seat, one hand gripping the chains that held Caraxes' harness, the other hand drawing the blade that had been passed down through generations of Targaryen warriors. Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel sword that had once belonged to Visenya, forged in the fires of old Valyria, slender and deadly. And then as Caraxes lunged upward, jaws wide, Daemon leaped. He did not leap to safety. He leaped from his saddle, from the back of his own dragon, directly onto the neck of Vhagar. It was a jump that defied reason, a leap of pure madness, and it happened in less than a heartbeat. The wind tore at his cloak, his silver hair streaming behind him like a banner of defiance. Aemond saw him coming, but there was no time to react. The prince was focused on controlling Vhagar's next attack, his one good eye fixed on the dragon below. He never saw Daemon land on Vhagar's spine, just behind the base of her skull. The impact sent a shudder through the ancient beast. Vhagar roared in confusion and rage, twisting her massive head to bite at the intruder. But Daemon was already moving. He scrambled up the ridges of her armoured neck, his boots finding purchase on scales that were each as wide as a shield. Dark Sister gleamed in the dying light, and Aemond finally turned, drawing his own sword, but it was too late. Daemon drove the Valyrian steel blade forward, with all the force of a lifetime of war, straight through the sapphire that had replaced Aemond's missing eye. The point of Dark Sister punched through the gemstone, through the socket, and deep into Aemond's brain. For a fraction of a second, the prince's good eye went wide, and then all went dark. He did not scream. There was no time for a scream. The sword had done its work, and Aemond Targaryen, the One Eye, the Kinslayer, the Prince Regent, died in that instant, still seated on Vhagar, a blade buried in his skull. But Daemon had no time to celebrate. He was still on Vhagar's back, and the dragon, now riderless and mad with pain and fury, began to twist and plummet. Below, Caraxes was already falling, mortally wounded from the collision. The two dragons, tangled together in a death grip, began their final descent. They fell from the sky like a comet of flesh and fire, spinning toward the dark waters of the God's Eye. The speed was unimaginable. Terminal velocity, the dragons' bodies screaming through the air, the lake rushing up to meet them with terrifying haste. When they struck, the impact was cataclysmic. Water exploded upward in a geyser that must have reached the clouds. The shockwave rippled across the lake, sending waves crashing into the shore for miles. For a long moment, there was nothing but chaos. Steam, foam, the hiss of cooling dragonfire, and then slowly, the surface began to settle. The waves diminished, the steam lifted, and silence fell over the God's Eye. It was the most profound silence any living soul in the Riverlands had ever known. The greatest dragon duel in the history of the Seven Kingdoms was over. Vhagar and Caraxes, two of the mightiest creatures ever to fly, lay beneath the water, their bodies intertwined in a final embrace of death, and with them, two princes of the dragon's blood, Daemon and Aemond, had vanished into the depths. No one would ever find their remains. No one would ever pull Dark Sister from Aemond's skull. The sword, the eye, the pride, the hatred. All of it sank into the murk, swallowed by the lake that had witnessed their end. In the days that followed, the court at King's Landing would whisper of the battle, of Daemon's insane leap, of the Sapphire Eye that was shattered forever. But for those who had been there, who had watched from the shore, the silence was what they remembered most. No more dragons roared over the God's Eye. No more fire lit the sky. The war would continue for a little while longer. But something had broken that day, something irreplaceable. And as for the man who had worn the Conqueror's crown, the man who had burned the Riverlands and loved a witch and dreamed of a throne he would never hold, his story did not end with his death. It continued in the legends that would follow, in the songs that would be sung, in the legacy of the One Eye. That legacy, tangled as it is with blood and fire and ambition, would echo through the ages, a warning to all who would reach for power without counting the cost. And we will explore that legacy and what it truly means in the chapter that follows. When Aemond Targaryen plunged Dark Sister through Aemond's Sapphire Eye, the two princes and their dragons tumbled from the sky in a knot of fire and fury. The waters of the God's Eye swallowed them whole, and for a long moment the world held its breath. Then the lake grew still again, as if it had never witnessed the end of a dynasty's most bitter blood feud. But the legacy of the One Eye did not sink into those dark waters. It lingered, like the smoke that clung to the surface for days afterward, refusing to dissipate. It would be years before anyone saw what remained of Aemond Targaryen. The war ground on without him, a dreary coda to a conflict that had already burned away everything precious. Rhaenyra took King's Landing, then lost it. Aegon II returned, crippled and bitter, only to be poisoned in his own bed. And through it all, the great dragons grew fewer, each battle claiming another beast, until only a handful remained, sickly and small compared to their ancestors. But far from the capital, in the haunted shadow of Harrenhal, there was one who waited. Alice Rivers had seen her visions fulfilled. She had told Aemond he would die in fire, and he had. She had told him his son would sit a throne, though she never said which one. And when the news of the battle above the God's Eye reached her, she did not weep. She simply turned from the window of the highest tower and held her belly, where a child stirred. A child, some whispered, had been fathered by the Prince Regent himself in those fevered nights before he rode to his doom. Years passed. The wars ended. The realm settled into an uneasy peace under a new king, Aegon III, a boy who had seen his mother devoured by a dragon and his uncles fall to blades and fire. He was called the Dragonbane, not because he hated them, but because by the time he took the throne, the great beasts were dying. The last true dragons, smaller, sicklier creatures, would wither away in the decades to come, and many who studied the dance of the dragons would point to one moment, one decision, as the beginning of the end. Aemond Targaryen, in his ambition and his rage, had done more than kill his nephew. He had proved that dragons could be killed, that kinslaying was not a curse but a tactic, that the bonds of blood meant nothing when measured against the thirst for power. The civil war he helped ignite consumed not just princes and princesses, but the very creatures that made them gods. And once the gods were dead, the world became ordinary again. In the year 130 after the conquest, in the depths of winter, a group of river lords and their men came to the God's Eye to salvage what they could from the wreckage of the war. The water had grown cold and dark, but they dragged the lake with nets and hooks, looking for weapons, armor, anything of value. What they found was Vargar, or what remained of her. The great dragon had settled into the mud. At the bottom, her bones picked clean by fish and time, and still strapped to her saddle, held by chains that had rusted but not broken, was a skeleton. The men knew it was Aemond. The silver hair, still faintly visible, clung to a skull that bore no flesh. The right eye socket gaped empty, as it had in life, but where the left eye should have been, a single sapphire winked in the filtered light of the lake's depths. The stone had been driven deep into the bone, and it remained there, a cruel jewel in a king's crown of death. They cut the chains and brought the body to the surface. The cloak had rotted away, but the Targaryen sigil, a three-headed dragon, could still be made out on a scrap of fabric that clung to the rib cage. They laid him on the shore, and for a moment, no one spoke. Here was the Kinslayer, the One Eye, the Prince Regent, who had worn the Conqueror's crown. Here was the boy who had lost his eye to a child's blow and plunged a kingdom into war to avenge it. Here was the Dragon Rider, who had burned villages and widowed mothers, who had flown above the clouds and sent thousands to their graves. And now here he was, a pile of bones, returned to the earth from which all men come, no more powerful than the smallest peasant who had died in his shadow. The River Lords did not know what to do with him. They sent word to King's Landing, but the court had little interest in honouring a traitor's corpse. Aemond had fought for Aegon II, and Aegon II was dead by poison. The new king, Aegon III, was a boy who had been raised by the Blacks. He had no love for his uncle, and so Aemond's remains were quietly interred in an unmarked grave near the lake, far from the dragon pit, far from the stone effigies of his ancestors. The sapphire was pried from his socket and sold to a merchant from Bravos, who cut it into a pendant and wore it around his neck until the day he drowned off the coast of Pentos. But what of the other legacy, the one that did not sink into the lake? Alice Rivers vanished from Harrenhal not long after the war ended. Some say she fled to the Free Cities, taking the child with her. Others say she remained in the Riverlands, living as a hermit, her prophecies growing darker and more desperate as the dragons faded from the world. And there are those who whisper that her son, Aemond's son, did not disappear. They whisper that he grew up in the shadows, that he learned the law of the Targaryens from his mother, and that when he was old enough, he made his way to a certain island in the smoking sea. There, it is said, he found the last surviving eggs of the great dragons, and he sat upon a stone chair in a cave, and he waited. But whether he hatched them, whether he claimed a throne, whether he ever truly existed at all, these questions have no answers. Only stories passed from tavern to tavern, from old woman to child, tales told to frighten and to wonder. The truth died with Alice Rivers, and she never said where she buried her secrets. And this is perhaps the most fitting end for a life like Aemond's. He reached for the sun, for the highest, most terrible power in the world, and he held it in his hands for a brief, brilliant moment. He commanded legions. He flew a dragon that could swallow cities. He made kings tremble and queens weep. But in the end, he lost everything. His eye, his honour, his soul, his life. He left behind a war that destroyed his house, a prophecy that may never have been fulfilled, and a body chained to a dead beast at the bottom of a lake. When they finally pulled him out, they did not bury him with his ancestors. They did not sing the ancient songs of Valyria over his grave. They did not carve his name in stone. They simply laid him in the earth and left him to the roots and the rain. And the sapphire that had replaced his lost eye, the jewel that had once glowed with stolen light, became a trinket in a dead merchant's pocket, lost to the sea. The boy who wanted everything, who wanted to be feared, to be remembered, be the dragon that all others bowed to, ended as nothing more than a caution, a lesson in the cost of hatred, the price of ambition, the weight of a crown worn too soon. The dance of the dragons consumed the Targaryens, and Aemond was the flame at its heart, burning so brightly that he incinerated himself along with everyone else. But in the quiet hours, when the wind blows off the god's eye, and the water ripples under a moon that saw it all, you can almost hear the echo of his voice, raging against the darkness. Or perhaps that is just the wind, carrying the whispers of a legacy that will never truly rest. And so we leave him there, not in the pages of history books, not in the songs of bards, but in the cold earth beside the lake, where the only monument he has is the memory of a war that ended everything. The One Eye, the Kinslayer, the Prince Regent, who wanted to be a conqueror and became a ghost instead. Sleep now, knowing that even the mightiest fall, that even the brightest flames gutter out, and that the night covers all. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content. And if you know someone who would find this as fascinating as you did, share it with them. These are the kind of conversations that matter.